The music was loud, the laughter louder, but behind the bar, everything stopped. I wasn't supposed to be there. I just wanted a quiet moment away from the noise, from the toasts and the fake smiles. Then I saw them. My father's hands on my mother's best friend, his lips pressed against hers like the world owed them secrecy. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest locked. My mind screamed. And then he saw me. His face twisted, not with shame, but fury. He crossed the space between us in 2 strides, and crack his hand met my cheek. "Stay quiet," he hissed, "or you'll regret it." I stayed quiet. Through dinner, through the vows, through my sister's perfect dance. But that silence didn't last long. By the next morning, the video of them had hit 5 million views, and my family's perfect little world was on fire. You think you've seen family scandals. You haven't seen this. Because what came after wasn't just betrayal. It was war. And by the time it was over, the man who taught me to fear silence would learn exactly what happens when his daughter finally speaks. My name is Nicole Barnes. I'm 36 years old and work as an interior designer in Seattle. I've never been famous or flashy, but I make a quiet living creating beautiful spaces for other people's lives. My own apartment is small, sunlit, filled with soft colours and things I've collected over the years, pieces that somehow make me feel safe. I've built my world carefully, one detail at a time, because that's what I do best, fix what's broken, without anyone noticing it was ever damaged. I wasn't always this way. Growing up in a small town in eastern Washington, I learned early that peace in the Barnes household was something you tiptoed around, not something you lived in. My father, Richard, was the kind of man people respected on the outside and feared inside their own walls. He worked in finance, always dressed sharp, always controlled. My mother, Margaret, kept the house spotless, her smile tight as if afraid it might crack. And then there was Emily, my little sister, 5 years younger, and forever the golden child. When she walked into a room, my father's eyes softened and my mother's voice turned sweet. When I walked in silence, often followed like even the air knew its place. I used to tell myself that every family had an Emily, someone easy to love, and a Nicole, the one who learned to manage herself so others didn't have to. I learned how to be useful. I did the dishes before being asked, got good grades, stayed out of trouble. When I went to college, my father didn't hug me goodbye. He just said, "Don't waste money chasing hobbies," and turned back to his newspaper. I left that day and never really came back. Not in the way daughters are supposed to. Seattle became my new home and distance became my safety. I called on birthdays, sent gifts at Christmas, but I never stayed long. It was easier to love my family from far away, like looking at an old photograph that still hurts if you stare too long. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, as I was finishing a client's project, a thick white envelope arrived in the mail. My name was written in my mother's neat slanted handwriting. Inside was an embossed card with gold trim. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Emily Barnes and Michael Hayes." The date was printed in elegant script 3 weeks away. I just sat there staring at it, the edges trembling between my fingers. I hadn't spoken to Emily in almost 2 years. Not because of any big fight, but because life in our family always seemed to drift toward her while drifting away from me. Every update I had came through my mother, who spoke of Emily's job, her fiancé, her success, as if reading a list of reasons I should feel proud instead of forgotten. But weddings have a way of pulling people back into places they've avoided. My mother's note tucked inside the envelope read, "It would mean a lot if you came. Families should be together for moments like this." I could almost hear her voice, gentle, careful, with that edge of guilt that never quite became apology. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and tried to imagine going home. The old house, the tidy yard, the smell of furniture polish, and my mother's perfume. I pictured my father's stare, the same look that once made me shrink at 12, and still lived somewhere under my skin. Could I walk into that house and pretend we were normal? Pretend that distance hadn't become my only form of peace? I thought of Emily, glowing in white, surrounded by everything that used to belong to all of us. Love, attention, approval. And I wondered if she'd even notice me sitting in the back row. Maybe she would. Maybe that's why they wanted me there, to fill the space, not to be part of it. The next morning I called my mother. I got the invitation, I said. She sounded hopeful, relieved. Oh good, we weren't sure it would reach you in time. Emily will be so happy. I hesitated. Will Dad be there? There was a small pause long enough to mean more than words. Of course, she said. He's walking her down the aisle. When we hung up, I sat by the window watching the city traffic move below. My reflection in the glass looked calm, but inside a familiar unease began to stir. Something about that invitation felt heavier than paper, like it carried all the years we never spoke of, the silences, the quiet judgments, the things left unresolved. I turned the card over one last time. Emily Barnes and Michael Hayes. My sister's perfect day. My family's perfect image. And me, the daughter who never quite fit in. Should I go? I looked at the calendar on the wall, then at the packed boxes from my last project waiting to be delivered. I told myself I was too busy, that no one would notice if I didn't show up. But deep down, something whispered otherwise. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was unfinished business. Or maybe it was that small, foolish hope that things could finally be different. By sunset, I had already checked flight prices, and somewhere inside I knew whether I wanted to or not, I was going home. And so 2 weeks later, I was standing in front of the Barnes house again, suitcase in hand, staring at the porch light that still flickered like it had 20 years ago. The roses were perfectly trimmed, the shutters freshly painted, but the house still breathed, that same uneasy quiet I'd carried with me for years. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Nicole, she said softly, her smile trembling at the corners. She hugged me quickly, careful not to wrinkle her blouse. You made it. I did, I said, trying to sound calm. The traffic was fine, she asked, already stepping aside. It was fine. That word again, always fine. The house smelled of lemon polish and lavender. It looked newer, fresh, paint new curtains, but under it all it was exactly the same. I followed her to the living room, my shoes sinking into the carpet I'd once vacuumed as a teenager. Your father's in there, she said, smoothing her skirt. He's busy with work calls, but he'll want to say hello. My father stood by the window phone to his ear posture, rigid as ever. His voice was clipped firm, his business voice, the one that never softened. When he saw me, he ended the call and gave a curt nod. Nicole, he said, you look older. Time does that, I answered, managing a small smile. He grunted, adjusted his cufflinks, and picked up his briefcase. You're staying long. Just a few days. Good, he said, and left the room without another word. My mother pretended to tidy up some papers. He's just under stress, she murmured. The business has been difficult lately. Sure, I said. He's always under stress. Dinner that night was polite, almost formal. My mother filled every silence with talk about the wedding florists, seating charts, how perfect Emily's dress was. I nodded when she spoke, but I could feel the distance between us, like we were all performing in a play we didn't remember auditioning for. Afterward, I wandered through the living room. There were new photos of Emily and her fiancé Michael, smiling under fairy lights. Their happiness filled the frames the way sunlight fills a room. There were no recent photos of me. I wasn't surprised. Nicole. My sister's voice carried from the hallway. She appeared in a blur of perfume and excitement, throwing her arms around me. You came! I can't believe it! I wouldn't miss it, I lied, holding her a little too tightly. She looked radiant, her engagement ring catching the light as she talked about floral themes and cake tastings. She barely asked about my life, but that was Emily. She didn't mean to overlook me. She just never noticed the spaces she left behind. When she was called away by one of her friends, I found myself alone again. I drifted to the kitchen, rinsing glasses out of habit, the sound of water soft and steady. My mother was still entertaining a few guests, laughter echoing faintly from the living room. Then I heard a familiar voice. One confident, too familiar. Richard, you haven't changed. said a woman laughing softly. I turned and saw her Susan, my mother's best friend for as long as I could remember. She looked elegant, polished, a little too perfect for a casual visit. She stood beside my father, touching his arm as they talked. The gesture was brief, but there was something in it that made me uneasy. "Mum?" I asked quietly later. I didn't know Susan was coming. "Oh yes," my mother said, stacking plates. "She's helping with the wedding. Emily trusts her taste." "Right," I said, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Susan had always been around when I was a child, bringing casseroles, gossiping over coffee. Back then, I never thought much of it. But now, watching the two of them together, I saw something else, an ease, a kind of familiarity that didn't belong to old friends. When the last guest left, the house grew quiet. My mother excused herself, saying she was exhausted. I stayed behind in the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to clean up. The lights were dim, the air heavy with the smell of candle wax and wine. I was drying the last glass when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My father's voice, low and controlled, carried through the dark. "You shouldn't stay too late," he said. Susan's voice followed, soft and amused. "You worry too much, Richard." I froze. Their silhouettes moved near the dining room archway. "Tomorrow's going to be busy," he said. "I'll see you tonight." Her laugh was quiet teasing. "You'd better make sure Margaret's asleep first." My throat tightened. The towel slipped from my hands, landing soundlessly on the counter. I stood perfectly still, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Through the narrow space between the doorway and the wall, I saw his hand brush hers, a quick practiced touch that told me this wasn't new. They moved down the hall together, their voices fading toward the back door. When they were gone, I sank into a chair, my pulse still racing. I tried to make sense of what I'd heard, but no explanation fit. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't innocent. My mother's best friend. My father. The realization landed heavy, cold, certain. I thought of my mother upstairs, probably folding linens for tomorrow, humming to herself, trusting the same woman who'd just slipped out with her husband. I stared at the faint reflection of the kitchen window, the flickering porch light outside casting uneven shadows across the walls. The house that once felt too quiet now felt suffocating, full of whispers that had always been there. I'd just never listened closely enough. I wanted to tell myself I'd misheard, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I already knew. My father didn't make mistakes like that. He was careful, calculated. Whatever was happening, it had been happening for a long time. For a few minutes, I just sat there, hands clasped, the silence pressing down on me. I thought of how my mother smiled at Susan earlier, how she thanked her for helping with the wedding. I thought of how my father never looked her in the eye anymore. And then something inside me shifted, something small but sharp. Maybe it was anger, or maybe it was that old ache of being invisible, of watching the truth play out while everyone pretended not to see. I stood, turned off the kitchen light, and looked once more toward the hallway where they disappeared. I didn't know what I was going to do yet or what it would cost me, but for the first time since stepping back into that house, I wasn't just uneasy, I was awake. Outside, the porch light flickered again, glowing and fading against the dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to warn me something was about to break. By the next morning, I understood what that feeling meant. The house buzzed with wedding preparation, the smell of fresh flowers, the clatter of dishes, the nervous chatter of relatives moving from room to room. It should have been a day filled with excitement, but all I could feel was a dull hum under my skin, like the air before a storm. Every sound felt louder than it should have been, and every glance sharper. I had slept barely 2 hours. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the back of my father's hand brush against Susan's, saw their silhouettes disappear down the hall. That image stuck like a thorn I couldn't pull out. I told myself I wouldn't think about it, that this day was for Emily. But pretending peace had never worked for me before, and it wasn't going to now. When I came downstairs, my mother was already bustling around the kitchen, a forced brightness in her voice as she directed everyone, like a conductor holding together an off-key orchestra. "Nicole, sweetheart, could you take those flowers out to the patio? Oh, and make sure the caterer knows where to set up. They'll be here soon." I nodded, obedient as ever, and carried the vases outside. The garden had been transformed overnight with strings of lights and white chairs lined in perfect rows. My mother had always been good at creating beautiful surfaces. She believed in order, in keeping up appearances, in smoothing over cracks before anyone noticed them. I used to think she did it out of pride. Now I wondered if it was fear. I set the flowers down, arranging them with the care I gave to every design project. It was easier to focus on placement, colour and balance than on the ache building inside me. Through the open window, I heard laughter drift from the living room. Susan's laugh, light and familiar. My hand froze. When I glanced inside, I saw my father standing near her, his tie loosened, holding a coffee cup. My mother was only a few feet away, talking to a cousin about seating arrangements, and yet the air between Richard and Susan was unmistakable. He leaned in slightly as she said something, her eyes lingering on his, in that way that people share when they've already crossed lines. It wasn't just imagination. It was memory repeating itself in daylight. Emily swept into the room, then radiant in a pale blue dress, the colour making her eyes shine. She kissed our father on the cheek, hugged Susan warmly, and then saw me standing near the doorway. "Oh, Nicole, can you help with the centerpieces?" The florist sent the wrong colour ribbons. "Sure," I said, managing a smile. It was easier than explaining the truth, easier than letting my eyes betray what I'd seen. In the dining room, I sat among half-unpacked boxes of decorations, trimming ribbons, while the rest of the house moved around me in a blur. Every now and then, Emily popped in to ask how things looked, or to change her earrings. She was glowing, caught in the bubble of her own happiness, untouched by the tension swirling just beneath the surface. I envied her. I used to think innocence was something you lost because of time, but now I saw it was a choice one she'd made without realising it. By afternoon, the rehearsal dinner was in full swing. Guests filled the rented venue, a charming old farmhouse just outside town. It was all candlelight and laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of music. I moved through it quietly, helping where I could, making sure everyone had what they needed. No one really saw me. I was the extra pair of hands, the background figure that kept things running smoothly. Richard was everywhere, shaking hands, smiling for photographs. To anyone else, he looked like the proud father of the bride, the picture of grace and control. But I saw the small tells, the way his gaze followed Susan across the room, the slight tilt of his head when she laughed. She too seemed to orbit the room in sync with him, never too close, never too far. It was choreography disguised as coincidence. I told myself to stay out of it. Whatever was happening between them, I didn't want to be part of it. I'd spent years avoiding this family's quiet disasters. But that resolve started to crumble after dinner, when I went to the back hall to return a box of tablecloths and caught a glimpse of them together near the bar. They were standing close, voices low out, his hand brushing her arm in a way that no one else would notice, but I did. I knew that language, the intimacy of people who think they're unseen. The flicker of guilt crossed Susan's face for just a second, but it vanished when she realised no one was looking. I tried to keep walking, but something stopped me. Maybe it was anger, maybe disbelief, maybe the simple, unbearable thought of my mother upstairs, fixing her hair completely unaware. I lingered near the kitchen doorway, pretending to adjust a tray of glasses. From where I stood, I could hear them more clearly. Susan's voice was soft, almost pleading. "You promised after the wedding." I know my father said his tone low measured, but it has to be handled carefully. "I can't just—" "Richard," she interrupted. "I've waited long enough." My stomach turned. I didn't know what after the wedding meant, but whatever it wasn't innocent. My mind raced through possibilities, money, property, maybe even a plan to leave my mother. Every option felt like a betrayal, stacked on another. Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward just enough to see them through the reflection in the window. His hand was on her back now, guiding her toward the back door. "I'll meet you outside," she said quietly. 5 minutes, he replied. They slipped away unnoticed by anyone else. The laughter from the main hall covered the sound of the door closing behind them. For a moment, I stood frozen, my pulse drumming in my ears. Then I heard my mother's voice calling from the other side of the room. "Cheerful, oblivious Nicole, "Sweetheart, have you seen your father?" "We need him for a photo." I swallowed hard. "He stepped out," I said. My voice steady though, my hands trembled. "Oh, probably checking on the caterers," she said lightly, turning back to the photographer. "He's always thinking of the details." I forced a smile and nodded. Then, as she turned away, I found myself moving toward the back door, every step slow, deliberate. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped outside. The string lights from the patio cast long, wavering shadows across the grass. In the distance, I could hear faint laughter from the guests, the music drifting through the open windows. Somewhere behind the bar, I heard voices, his and hers, low and urgent. My heart pounded, the sound mixing with the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I hesitated for only a moment, standing between the safety of not knowing and the danger of finding out. Then I took a breath, pushed open the gate, and started walking toward the back of the venue. The moment the gate closed behind me, the music from the reception dimmed into a distant hum. Out here, everything felt colder, sharper, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the glow of celebration, replaced by the quiet pulse of night air. I could hear the faint rustle of trees, the whisper of voices carried on the wind. I moved slowly, careful with each step, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes. The bar was set up behind the venue, tucked away near the catering tents. During the day, it had seemed harmless, a cheerful little space, with fairy lights strung above and bottles lined neatly on wooden shelves. Now it looked different. Half the lights were off, the shadows, long and deep. I could hear them before I saw them. My father's low voice firm controlled the same tone he used when he wanted someone to listen. Then Susan's voice, softer, coaxing, full of something that didn't belong in this place. I stopped half hidden behind a trellis draped in ivy. The sight of them hit me like a blow. My father had his hands on Susan's face, her arms wrapped around his neck, their bodies pressed close in a kiss so intimate it stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't just a mistake or a brief slip of judgment, it was passion practiced and familiar. I couldn't move. My fingers went numb around the glass I'd been carrying. I heard my own heartbeat, louder than the music, faster than I could think. The woman who had been in our home for years, who'd comforted my mother, who'd watched me grow up, her hands were on my father like she belonged to him. The glass slipped before I could catch it. It hit the stone floor and shattered, the sound cracking through the night like thunder. They broke apart instantly. Susan gasped, turning toward the noise, her lipstick smudged her face, pale in the dim light. My father's eyes found mine, and for a second he froze. His expression wasn't guilt, it was fury. "Nicole," he said, his voice low, dangerous. I stepped back, my hands trembling. "What are you doing?" The question came out as a whisper, but it felt enormous, like it might split me in half. He moved toward me quickly, his jaw tight, his eyes dark. "You shouldn't be here. You're kissing Mum's best friend," I said. "How could you?" Before I could finish, his hand came down across my face. The sound cracked through the air. The sting burned hot against my skin, spreading to my neck, my chest. I stumbled back, my mouth open but no sound coming out. He had never hit me before. Not once. The man who prided himself on control, who spoke in cold commands rather than violence, had just crossed that line without hesitation. "Stay quiet," he hissed. His face was inches from mine, his breath sharp with whiskey. "You didn't see anything. You don't know anything." Susan stood frozen behind him, one hand at her mouth, eyes wide with shock. "Richard, stop," she whispered, but he didn't even glance at her. His focus was all on me. I wanted to scream, to tell him I would never keep his secret, but the words tangled in my throat. I could taste blood where I'd bitten my lip. My father straightened his voice, steadying that familiar coldness returning. "You will not ruin your sister's wedding over some misunderstanding," he said. "Do you hear me, misunderstanding?" My voice broke. "You were kissing her. You don't know what you saw," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. "You're emotional. You've always been dramatic, Nicole." Susan took a small step forward, her hands trembling. Richard, please. He turned on her so fast she flinched. Go, he ordered. Now. She hesitated, then slipped past me. Eyes lowered her heels, clicking softly against the stones. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and sweet, the scent colliding with the metallic tang of my fear. When she was gone, he turned back to me. If you say a word of this to your mother, he said quietly, I will make sure you regret it. The threat landed like a physical thing, heavy and deliberate. I wanted to believe he didn't mean it, that this was anger talking, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. There was something unrecognizable in him, a calculation, a kind of cold panic. I lifted my hand to my cheek. It throbbed under my fingers. You think I'm afraid of you? I said softly. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. You've always been afraid of me. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. I could see the vein in his temple, the tension in his jaw, the small twitch in his hand, as if he wasn't sure whether to reach for me or strike again. Then, as if deciding I wasn't worth another second, he turned and walked away. His shoes crunched against the gravel until the sound disappeared completely. I stood there shaking, the cool air stinging against my burning skin. My breath came unevenly. Somewhere inside the venue, the band started a new song, something bright, joyful, painfully out of place. I looked down at the broken glass at my feet. The pieces glittered faintly under the string lights, sharp and scattered, reflecting fragments of me I didn't recognize. For a moment, I thought about picking them up, but what was the point? Some things couldn't be swept back together. The silence settled again, heavy and absolute. I took a step back toward the building, my legs weak, my mind still trying to catch up with what had happened. Then something caught my eye. A small red light blinking above the bar. At first, I thought it was part of the decor, a tiny reflection from the string lights. But when I looked closer, I saw it was the lens of a security camera. It was fixed directly on the bar, the same place where my father and Susan had been standing. My heart skipped. The camera was recording. The red light blinked again, steady and unblinking, as if watching me. For a long moment, I stood frozen, staring at that light. Then a thought took shape, slow, terrifying, electric. Someone had seen. Someone would know. I pressed my fingers against my cheek, feeling the raw outline of his hand, and for the first time since the night began, I wasn't just hurt. I was angry. Not the quiet kind of anger I'd carried for years, but something fierce, alive, dangerous. The music from inside swelled as a cheer rose from the crowd. I could hear my sister laughing, the sound bright and innocent, untouched by what had just happened outside. I turned toward the door, forcing myself to breathe, to walk to appear normal. But inside my chest everything had changed. Whatever I had been before, dutiful daughter, quiet observer, the one who kept peace by keeping silent, was gone. I glanced once more at the blinking red light. The camera kept recording its little eye glowing in the dark. Someone had caught everything. When I woke the next morning, I thought for a moment that it had all been a nightmare. The slap, the threat, the camera blinking red in the dark, surely that couldn't have happened. But as soon as I sat up, the sting on my cheek reminded me that it was real. My reflection in the mirror confirmed it. A faint red mark still lingered beneath the skin. I touched it carefully, half in disbelief, half in shame. The house was already alive with the noise of wedding morning chaos. Voices, doors slamming, the hum of a coffee maker. Sunlight poured through the curtains, too bright, too clean for what I carried inside. I took a deep breath and told myself to move, to go through the motions. Pretend. That had always been the family rule after all. Pretend everything is fine until it looks that way. Downstairs, the kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. My mother was directing caterers, her tone brisk but her face pale. Emily was sitting at the table, scrolling on her phone, her expression caught between confusion and panic. I was halfway to the coffee pot when she looked up. "Oh my God," she said softly, eyes wide. "You've seen it, haven't you?" "Seen What I asked, though, I already knew from the way her voice shook that something had happened. She turned her phone toward me. On the screen was a paused video grainy security footage from the bar lit by string lights. I saw my father and Susan, their faces clear, their kiss undeniable. My breath caught. In the corner of the video, a timestamp glowed in red. The same time I'd been there, the same camera I'd noticed blinking. Someone had uploaded it. "Where did you get that?" I whispered. "It's everywhere," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Twitter, Facebook, even TikTok, 5 million views overnight. People are calling it the father of the bride affair." My knees went weak. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. "Who posted it?" "No one knows," she said, "but everyone's talking about it." Before I could respond, my father's voice thundered from the hallway. "Nicole." He stormed into the kitchen, his phone in hand, his face red with fury. "What did you do?" he barked. "I didn't do anything," I said, taking a step back. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "You were there last night. You saw that camera. Don't tell me you didn't take it." "Take it? I didn't even know it was recording," I said. "I just found out about the video." He slammed his phone down on the counter, the screen lighting up with notifications. "Do you have any idea what this has done? The company, the family, the wedding. Everything is ruined because of you." "Because of me," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "You're the one who—" "Stop!" My mother's voice cut through the room. She stood by the sink, her face stricken, her hands shaking. "Both of you, please." But he wasn't listening. "I warned you to stay quiet," he said, his voice low and dangerous now. "You couldn't even do that." Something inside me broke then. The fear, the shame, it all gave way to disbelief. "You think I wanted this," I said. "You think I'd humiliate my own family?" "You did that yourself, Nicole," Emily said softly. "Please, don't, what?" I turned to her. "Don't tell the truth. Don't ruin the picture-perfect lie we've all been living in." My father stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "You've always been jealous," he said, his words cold as glass, "of your sister, of this family, of everything you couldn't have. And now you finally got your revenge." I stared at him stunned. "You really believe that—" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. My mother's eyes filled with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "Please stop this. It's Emily's wedding day. Can't we just hold it together until after?" I really looked at her, and for the first time I saw how small she'd become under his shadow. Her hands twisted together, her shoulders hunched, her mouth set in a line that begged for peace at any cost. And suddenly I realized that peace had always been her bargain with the devil. The next few hours blurred into chaos. The wedding planner arrived in a panic. Reporters were calling, and whispers spread like wildfire through the guests who were already arriving. I stayed in the background watching the world unravel. Every few minutes I caught sight of my father pacing, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders to someone about damage control. Susan never showed up. Emily tried to smile through it all, her hands trembling as she clutched her bouquet. By noon, the tension reached its breaking point. My father pulled me aside near the back hallway, his voice low but vicious. "You're leaving," he said. "Now. Before you destroy anything else, you can't just—" He leaned in, eyes hard. "You are not welcome here, Nicole. You're done." I turned to Emily for help, but she just shook her head, tears in her eyes. "Why would you do this today of all days?" she whispered. "You could have told us privately, but you waited until now. How could you be so selfish?" I felt my throat tighten. "Emily, I didn't," but she stepped back like even my words might stain her dress. "You've always made everything about you." My mother appeared then, her face, pale eyes wet. "Please, Nicole," she said softly. "Just go. Let us get through this." For a moment I thought about fighting back, about shouting the truth for everyone to hear. But what would it matter? No one in that house had ever believed me. Not when I was a child, not now. So I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. As I stepped outside, the sound of laughter floated faintly from inside hollow and rehearsed. The perfect family, carrying on pretending again as they always had. I stood on the steps, the cool breeze brushing against my face, and for the first time, I felt completely alone. The weight of their rejection pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Miss Barnes." I turned. A young waiter stood there holding a small silver tray. He couldn't have been more than 20, his dark hair falling into his eyes. On the tray lay a simple black USB drive. "What is that?" I asked. He hesitated, glancing toward the house before leaning closer. "Someone wanted you to have this," he said quietly. "They said, you should watch it." I frowned, my heartbeat quickening. "Who gave it to you?" He shook his head. "I don't know. They just said it was important." He pressed the USB into my hand and walked away before I could ask anything else. I stared at it, the small piece of plastic gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Somewhere inside, music began to play soft, romantic, oblivious. The wedding was starting. I slipped the drive into my pocket, still feeling the sting on my cheek, still hearing my father's voice in my head. I didn't know what was on it yet, but one thing was certain. Someone else knew the truth. And for the first time in years, that truth might finally have a voice. I drove for hours that night without knowing exactly where I was going. I just needed distant miles of quiet road between me and the house I'd been thrown out of. The sky had turned the colour of steel, the rain coming down in thin, steady lines that blurred the world beyond my windshield. My phone buzzed constantly on the seat beside me, calls, messages, news alerts, but I couldn't bring myself to look. Every headline would say the same thing anyway, that the perfect Barnes family had fallen apart in front of 5 million strangers. I ended up at a roadside motel just outside of Tacoma. The neon sign blinked half-dead letters into the wet night, and the clerk didn't look up from his magazine when I paid for a room. Inside it smelled of dust and bleach. I sat on the edge of the bed, the USB still warm in my pocket. For a long time, I just stared at it. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to stop chasing whatever ugliness it held. But another part, the one that had always wanted answers, wouldn't let go. I found my laptop at the bottom of my bag, plugged the USB in, and waited for the screen to come alive. The folder opened with a single file marked by a date 2 weeks before Emily's wedding. My pulse quickened as I double-clicked it. The video opened to a familiar room, my father's study. He was sitting at his desk, papers spread out in front of him, his voice low but clear. "She'll sign it eventually," he said. "She always does. She trusts me." Off camera, Susan's voice replied calm and confident. "And when she does, everything moves into your name. The house, the stocks, the trust." "Exactly," he said. "Once it's done, Margaret will think it's just a refinance. She won't suspect a thing." I froze. The sound of my own heartbeat filled the space between their words. Susan stepped into view, then her face caught by the dim light. She was holding a folder, tapping it against her hand like a habit. "You're sure you want to do this before the wedding?" she asked. "People will be watching. And she's your wife, Richard." He looked up, his expression as composed as ever. "She's been my liability for years. This family could be so much more without her pulling it down." Susan smiled faintly. "And what about Nicole?" He hesitated. "She's nothing to worry about. Always too busy pretending to be independent to realise she's irrelevant." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd known he saw me as a disappointment, but hearing it spoken so casually, so coldly, it hollowed something inside me. Susan set the folder on the desk, flipping through the papers. "You'll need her signature on this one," she said, pointing to a form, labelled Transfer of Beneficiary Rights. "Once it's filed, you're in full control." He leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "And then we disappear for a while. A trip, maybe. Somewhere quiet until it all settles." Her voice softened. Together, he smiled the kind of smile that used to make people trust him. Together. I stopped the video, pressing my fingers to my forehead. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. The slap, the threats, the affair, they weren't about passion or weakness. They were about control, about money. My father hadn't just betrayed my mother's trust. He was preparing to take everything from her. For years, I had told myself that my parents' marriage was built on fear, on duty, on habit. But now, I saw what it really was, a transaction. My mother's silence had been the currency that kept it intact, and he'd used it until there was nothing left to spend. I clicked play again, unable to stop. The video cut to another scene, same room, different night. My father was pacing, phone pressed to his ear. "No, she doesn't know," he said sharply. "Margaret thinks the loan documents are routine. She'll sign them before the rehearsal dinner." He paused, listening. "Yes, Susan knows what to do." My stomach turned. The rehearsal dinner. That meant the plan was still in motion right up until the moment everything fell apart. I scrubbed through the footage, the screen flickering with fragments of their scheme. Scanned documents, conversations, signatures passed across the desk. And then, near the end, a flash of movement caught my eye. It was Susan again, alone this time, looking directly into the camera. Her expression was tight, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're seeing this," she said, "then something's gone wrong." She hesitated, glancing toward the door. "He thinks he's untouchable. But if he hurts me or anyone else, make sure this doesn't disappear." The video cut out. I sat there in silence, staring at the frozen screen. My thoughts tangled and twisted, trying to make sense of it. Susan wasn't just his accomplice. She was afraid of him too. Whatever game they were playing, she'd left this as a safeguard. Maybe she knew it would surface someday. Maybe she'd wanted it to. I leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pressing into my bones. Outside rain hit the window in steady rhythms. I imagined my mother at home, still trying to smile for guests, still unaware that the man beside her was plotting to strip her of everything. For the first time, in a long while, I felt something sharper than hurt clarity. This wasn't a family falling apart by accident. It was being taken apart piece by piece by the person who had always demanded silence. I replayed the last few seconds of the video, Susan's warning echoing in my ears. "If you're seeing this, then something's gone wrong." Something had gone wrong. And now I was part of it. I opened my laptop again and started copying the files onto a separate drive. My hands were steady this time. I didn't know yet who I could trust or what it would take to expose him, but I knew I couldn't walk away. When the transfer finished, I unplugged the USB and slipped it into my pocket. The storm outside had quieted, the world washed clean for a moment before the next wave of chaos. I stood by the window, looking out at the reflection of my face in the glass. I could still see the faint mark on my cheek where he'd hit me, but now it felt like something different. Not a wound, but a reminder. If silence built this family, I whispered to the empty room, I'll be the one to break it. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the world outside still looked grey and washed out, like it hadn't quite woken up. I checked out of the motel and drove without a plan, just a need to keep moving to escape the stale air of betrayal that clung to me. The image of my father and Susan plotting in that video looped in my mind until it blurred into something almost unreal. I needed air distance, something that reminded me of who I'd been before all of this. I didn't realise where I was going until I saw the sign for County Road 12, the turn-off toward my grandparents' old farmhouse. My hands turned the wheel before my mind caught up. The drive was familiar, the same twisting road that had carried me there every summer as a child. Trees lined the edges like sentinels, their branches heavy with rain. When I reached the top of the hill, the house appeared standing weathered but proud against the flat horizon. The place had been abandoned for years since my grandmother moved into assisted living. The white paint was peeling and the porch sagged in the middle, but the old swing still hung there, its chain creaking in the wind. I parked under the oak tree and got out. The air smelled of damp grass and old wood, that scent of forgotten summers. I pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was quiet except for the faint hum of wind slipping through the cracks. Dust lay over everything like a fine grey blanket. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps soft on the warped floorboards. The wallpaper had faded to the colour of old linen peeling in long strips. I could still see the pencil marks on the doorframe where my grandmother had measured our heights, mine stopping a few inches below Emily's. In the kitchen, the wooden table still stood under the window. I ran my hand along its edge, remembering Sunday dinners, the smell of cornbread and coffee. The sound of my grandfather's laughter before it all turned into arguments whispered behind closed doors. My mother had spent hours in this kitchen washing dishes, while pretending not to hear the tension in the next room. A memory rose unbidden. I was 10 drying plates beside her while my father and grandfather argued about money in the parlour. I'd asked why no one ever told them to stop shouting. My mother hadn't looked up when she said it. We keep quiet to keep peace. At the time, it sounded like wisdom. Now it sounded like surrender. I sat down at the table, the wood cool beneath my palms. My grandmother had lived by that same rule. She'd endured her husband's affairs and her son's temper with that same quiet endurance. My mother had inherited it, and she'd passed it to me without ever meaning to. Silence was our inheritance, as much a part of this family as the house itself. I looked around and realised how much of it had already rotted. The walls, the furniture, even the air, it all carried the weight of years spent swallowing the truth. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. It had cost every woman in this family something: my grandmother's pride, my mother's happiness, my own voice. I went upstairs, careful where the boards bowed under my feet. The rooms were almost empty now. In the guest room, a thin layer of dust covered everything but a small photo album, still sat on the dresser. I opened it carefully. The pages were brittle, the photographs faded, but there we all were: my father, my mother, my grandparents, Emily and me. Smiling, posed, perfect. You'd never know from those frozen smiles that anything was wrong. That was what silence did, it turned pain invisible. I closed the album and set it back. Through the window, I could see the field stretching out for miles, tall grass bending in the wind. I wondered how many arguments those walls had absorbed, how many tears had been shed in the name of keeping peace. I thought about my mother, probably at home now, still clinging to the hope that the chaos would pass if she just pretended hard enough. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. For a second, I almost ignored it, expecting more messages or headlines about the scandal. But when I looked, the name on the screen froze me in place. Jack Harris. It had been years. Jack and I had met in college. He studied journalism back then, full of big ideas and quiet confidence. He'd been one of the few people I could talk to without feeling small. We'd lost touch when I left Seattle for work, exchanging a few holiday messages before life took over. I hadn't thought of him in months, and now his name glowed on my screen like a reminder of a part of me I'd buried. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the green button. For a moment, I thought about letting it ring out. But curiosity, or maybe something like hope, made me press accept. Jack, I said softly. Nicole, he replied, his voice low and familiar, warm in a way that caught me off guard. It's been a long time. I laughed a little more out of nerves than humour. Yeah, it has. I saw what happened, he said. The video, the news, I didn't want to call, but I thought you might need someone who isn't standing on the sidelines judging you. I closed my eyes, leaning against the wall. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that right now. There was a pause. I might know more than you think, he said. That video, someone sent me the original file last night, before it hit the internet. I straightened. What do you mean? I think whoever recorded it wanted it to reach you, Nicole. Not the public. You were supposed to see it first. My pulse quickened. But why me? Because he said slowly, the USB you have, it's not just about the affair. There's something else buried in those files. Something bigger. I looked around the old house, the ghosts of my family pressing in from every corner, and, for the first time since leaving home, I felt the faint pull of direction, of purpose. The silence I'd inherited had always told me to stay still to endure. But Jack's words reminded me that maybe, finally, it was time to move. "Can we meet?" he asked. "Somewhere quiet. I'll explain everything." I hesitated only a second. "There's an old farmhouse just outside town," I said. "You'll find it at the end of County Road 12. He exhaled softly like he already knew the place. "I'll be there in an hour." When the call ended, I stayed where I was, phone still warm in my hand. Outside, the wind picked up sweeping through the fields until they rippled like water. I thought of my mother's voice again, that same line looping through my memory. "We keep quiet to keep peace." I looked at the dust-covered table at the silent rooms around me and whispered to no one. And that's exactly how we lost it. Then I picked up my keys, stepped back into the fading light, and waited for Jack Harris to find me. The sun had just started dipping below the tree line when Jack's car appeared on the gravel road. I heard it before I saw it, the low hum of the engine echoing against the quiet fields. I stood by the porch arms, folded against the evening chill, and for a moment, I felt 16 again, waiting for someone who actually showed up when they said they would. He stepped out of the car, taller than I remembered, his hair flecked with grey at the temples, the same steady presence that had always made me feel like the ground under my feet wasn't moving quite so fast. He gave a half smile as he approached. "You look the same," he said. "Liar," I replied, but I couldn't help smiling back. He glanced around at the sagging farmhouse. "You always did know how to pick the most cheerful meeting spots." "Memories," I said simply. "And privacy." Jack nodded, slipping his hands into his jacket pockets. "I figured. After what I saw last night, you're going to need both." Something in his tone made me uneasy. "You said someone sent you the video before it went public," I said. "Who?" "I don't know," he said. "It came from an encrypted email with no sender name, just a single line. She deserves the truth." Then the file. He looked at me carefully. "I thought maybe you'd already seen it." "I have," I said quietly, "and more." I told him about the USB, about the files, about the recording of my father and Susan plotting to take my mother's assets. Jack listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he ran a hand over his jaw. "That explains a lot," he said. "I've been digging into Richard Barnes for years, small stuff at first, shady consulting contracts, tax irregularities. But I never had enough to tie anything together." My pulse quickened. "You think this could be connected?" "I think it's all connected," he said. "But if he's moving money through your mother's name, that's not just fraud. That's laundering." The word hung in the air like something poisonous. Jack glanced toward the house. "Mind if we work inside? I brought my laptop." We went into the kitchen. The air inside was cooler now, shadows stretching across the floor. He sat up at the table, opening his laptop while I plugged in my USB drive. The familiar click of keys filled the quiet as we opened folders, scanning documents line by line. "This is bad," Jack muttered after a few minutes. "See these wire transfers? He's funneling money from his firm into dummy accounts under shell corporations. Classic laundering structure, nothing too big individually, but steady, consistent, almost elegant in how hidden it is." "Elegant," I repeated. "That's one word for it." He turned the screen toward me. "Here's where it gets worse. These accounts aren't just offshore, they're under your mother's name. Look." I leaned closer. My mother's signature was there, copied perfectly onto several authorization forms. Only I knew that handwriting. My father had always handled the finances. She never even signed checks without asking him first. "He forged her name," I said. "Probably," Jack replied. "And judging by the amounts he's been doing it for years." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. How does something like this even work? How could he hide this from everyone? Jack pointed to a chart of transactions. He keeps it small, regular, and layered. Each transfer looks like a business expense. And he uses personal trusts as shields. It's not about hiding millions, it's about staying invisible. The thought of my father so proud, so disciplined, sitting in his office, Fabricating documents to steal from his own wife made me feel physically ill. I stood and walked to the window, the night pressing close against the glass. All this time, I said quietly, he made her think she was the problem. Every time she questioned the bills or the accounts, he made her feel paranoid, and he was the one lying all along. Jack watched me for a moment before closing his laptop. "Nicole," he said gently, "this isn't just about betrayal anymore. It's criminal. If this goes public the right way, he won't just lose his reputation, he could face prison." I turned back to him. "If I can prove it, you already can," he said, tapping the USB. "This is evidence, but you need to be careful. If Richard suspects you're digging, he'll come after you. People like him always do." I let out a shaky breath. "He already has. He hit me last night." Jack's expression hardened. "He what?" "It doesn't matter," I said quickly. "He's always been that way, controlled, calculated." "He won't lose," quietly. Jack stood crossing his arms. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to control the story." He paced the room thinking. "If we can trace these transfers to a shell company, we can prove intent. I have a contact at the Seattle Financial Crimes Office. Off the record, of course, but we'll need time and a clean copy of everything. Nothing can tie back to you until we're ready." I nodded slowly. "I can do that." We spent the next hour sorting through files, copying data, listing dates. Each number told a story, money leaving the firm, vanishing overseas, only to return later as legitimate profit. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became. My father wasn't just covering an affair or a mistake. He was building an empire of lies, one forged signature at a time. At one point, Jack leaned back, exhaling heavily. "You know, I always thought your dad had that kind of too clean reputation that makes journalists suspicious. Turns out I should have followed my instincts." I half smiled despite myself. "He's always been good at looking like the hero. That's what makes it so easy for him." Jack studied me for a moment. "You've changed," he said softly. "You're not that girl who used to back down when people got loud." "I've had to," I said. "Silence doesn't save anyone." We went back to work, the hours slipping by unnoticed. Outside, crickets sang in the dark, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills. When we finally stopped, it was well past midnight. The table was covered in notes and open files, our laptops still glowing faintly. Jack closed his computer and rubbed his temples. "This is enough to start building a case," he said. "If we can confirm one of these accounts exists, we'll have proof of laundering." I nodded, exhausted, but sharper than I'd felt in days. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to what he'd done. I was doing something about it. Jack packed up his things, but before leaving, he paused in the doorway. "You realize what this means, right?" I looked up from the table. "That my father's going to lose everything." He shook his head slowly. "No. That this is only the beginning." He stepped outside, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his shoes, fading into the night. I followed him to the porch, watching as he opened his car door. He hesitated, glancing back at me. "Nicole," he said quietly, "your father's not just cheating." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying his words like a verdict. "He's laundering." That word followed me all night, echoing through my mind long after Jack's car disappeared down the road. I barely slept, haunted by the image of my father's calm, calculating face, the man who had built his entire life on control, now exposed as something far uglier. By morning, I knew what I had to do. If Jack and I were right, my mother was living in a house full of lies, papers forged under her name. Money moved through her accounts. She had to be told. But a darker thought pressed at the edges of my mind. What if she already knew? The drive back to town felt longer than it should have. The wedding decorations still hung along Main Street, faded and limp from the rain. It was strange how life went on, as if nothing had happened, as if our family hadn't just been ripped apart in front of the entire internet. I parked in front of the house, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before getting out. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything was quiet except for the faint sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen. My mother sat at the table, folding napkins, still methodical. her hands moving like she was trying to keep the world from falling apart one linen square at a time. When she looked up and saw me, her smile wavered. "Nicole," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here. Your father." "I know what he's done," I interrupted. "And you do too, don't you?" She froze the napkin slipping from her hands. "What are you talking about?" "Don't," I said, my voice breaking. "Please don't do that. Don't act like you don't know what's been happening." She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the tile. "You need to calm down." "No," I said. "For once, you need to stop being calm." Her face tightened, that same mask of composure she'd worn my entire life. "Whatever you think, you know, I've seen the files," I said. "The forged signatures, the transfers, everything. He's been stealing from you, Mum, for years." The colour drained from her face. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she sank back into the chair and pressed her hands to her temples. "Oh God," she whispered. "So you didn't know I asked carefully." But when she lifted her head, her eyes told me otherwise. "I knew," she said quietly. "Not the details, but enough." The words hit like a physical blow. "You knew." She nodded, tears forming but never falling. "I found the papers months ago. I confronted him. He told me it was temporary, just business restructuring. He said it would protect the family." She laughed bitterly. "I wanted to believe him. I always wanted to believe him." I pulled out a chair and sat down, my chest tight. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you leave?" She looked at me like I was a child again, asking something simple and naive. "Leave with what, Nicole? He controls everything. The house, the accounts, the insurance. If I walked away, I'd have nothing." "You'd have your freedom," I said. "Freedom," she repeated. "What kind of freedom is that? To start over at my age with no money, no home, and 2 daughters who barely speak to me. You don't understand what it's like to live under someone like him. Every decision I've ever made, I made because I had to survive him." Her words cut deep, but I couldn't let go of the anger. "You didn't just survive him, Mum. You protected him. You covered for him. You let him treat us like we were problems to be managed." Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "I did what I thought was best. For who?" I asked softly. "Because it sure wasn't for me." We sat in silence, the clock ticking loudly on the wall. I wanted to reach for her to forgive her, but part of me couldn't. I'd spent my whole life mistaking her quietness for strength. Now I saw it for what it was, fear, the kind that seeps into everything until it becomes a habit. She wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve. "I thought if I kept things steady, if I didn't provoke him, he'd eventually stop. He used to be kind, you know. Before the business grew, before the money started changing everything. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't. My father had always been this way. He'd just gotten better at hiding it." "Mum," I said quietly, "it's not just about you anymore. He's done things that could destroy more than this family. Jack and I found proof he's been laundering money through offshore accounts." She looked up sharply. "Jack, an old friend. He's helping me investigate. We're going to expose him." Panic flickered in her eyes. "Nicole, you can't. You don't know what he's capable of." "I know exactly what he's capable of," I said. "I've lived it." She shook her head. "You don't understand. He has people who owe him favours, lawyers, investors, even the police. If you go after him, he'll ruin you. He'll ruin all of us." "Maybe," I said, my voice steady, "but he's already ruined everything that mattered." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. I'd never seen her look so small. I wanted to reach out to comfort her, but something inside me resisted. It wasn't cruelty, it was exhaustion. I was tired of being the one who understood while everyone else looked away. Finally, she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "You think you know everything, but you don't." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window, as if afraid someone might be listening. "There are things you don't know about Susan." The name sent a chill through me. "What about her?" My mother met my eyes, her voice trembling. She's not just your father's mistress. She's part of all of this. And if you keep digging, you'll find she has more to lose than any of us. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. What are you talking about? Her lips pressed together as if she'd already said too much. Just promise me one thing, she said. Whatever you do next, be careful. The truth doesn't always set you free, Nicole. Sometimes it destroys you. I stood slowly, her words sinking like stones in my chest. For years I had wondered why my mother never fought back. Now I saw that maybe she had just not in ways that anyone noticed. As I turned to leave, she reached for my hand. I'm sorry, she whispered, for all the times I stayed quiet. I looked down at her, torn between anger and pity. Then, maybe it's time you stop. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon light had turned soft and gold, but I barely noticed. My mind raced with questions about my father's crimes, about Susan, about how deep this betrayal really went. Behind me, through the half-closed door, I heard my mother's voice again, low and strained. There are things you don't know about Susan. Those words echoed in my head the entire drive back to the farmhouse. My mother's face, pale and trembling, wouldn't leave my mind. She'd said it like a confession, but also like a warning. When I stepped inside, the smell of coffee still lingered from the night before. Jack was there, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the faint glow casting shadows under his eyes. He looked up when I entered. I've been waiting, he said. You need to see this. He turned the screen toward me. Numbers and account codes filled the display, a spreadsheet that made my stomach twist. What am I looking at? Offshore transactions, he said. Regular transfers over 5 years. All under your mother's name. I frowned. That's impossible. She barely knows how to send an email. Exactly, Jack said. It's not her. He forged her signature. He zoomed in on a scanned document. The signature was perfect. Too perfect. The loops and curves were exact replicas copied from some old file, probably one she'd signed years ago. Your father's been moving company money into offshore accounts, Jack explained, using your mother as a legal shield. If anyone looks into it, she's the one who'll take the blame. I felt a slow chill spread through me. So he's been stealing from her while making her look like the criminal. Jack nodded grimly. Classic laundering setup. Clean, deliberate, and completely hidden until now. I sank into a chair staring at the screen. She's spent years defending him. And all this time he's been turning her into his scapegoat. Jack leaned forward, his voice low. Nicole, this goes beyond family betrayal. It's fraud, tax evasion, international laundering. If the authorities get involved, your mother could be implicated unless we prove forgery. I looked up sharply. Then we prove it. He hesitated. We can, but she has to cooperate. And there's something else you need to know. He clicked another tab. A video upload log appeared. I traced the original source of the affair video, the one that went viral. It wasn't an anonymous leak. I felt my pulse quicken. What do you mean it was uploaded from your parents' home network? He said. The IP address matches their router. The timestamp matches the night after the rehearsal dinner. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Are you saying my mother posted it? I'm saying the upload came from her computer, Jack replied carefully. Whether she meant to or not, that's what we need to find out. The air in the room grew heavy. I thought back to her trembling hands, the way she'd begged me to be careful, the fear in her voice when she talked about my father. Could it be true? Could she have been the one who set everything in motion? I have to talk to her, I said finally. Jack reached out, stopping me. Nicole, think this through. If she did leak it, she's not your enemy. She's probably more trapped than you realise. I nodded, though my chest tightened with confusion and anger. I'll be careful. The drive to my parents' house felt like moving through fog. When I arrived, the lights were still on. My mother was sitting on the couch, her shoulders slumped, a half-empty cup of tea beside her. She looked up when I came in, but didn't seem surprised. I figured you'd be back, she said quietly. I stood in the doorway, unable to keep my voice steady. Jack traced the video. It came from here, from your laptop. Her lips parted, but no denial came. She looked down at her hands, then nodded. Yes, it was me. The words seemed to echo in the room. Why, I whispered. Her voice trembled, because I couldn't take it anymore. I thought if the truth came out, if people saw what he was, then maybe someone would finally stop him. So you ruined him publicly. Tears filled her eyes. I didn't plan for it to spread like that. I just wanted it documented, proof of who he really was. But once it was online, there was no stopping it. I sat down slowly. You should have told me. I wanted to protect you, she said. You've always carried the truth for everyone else. I didn't want to give you this too. You didn't protect me, I said quietly. You left me standing in the middle of it. She wiped at her tears. You think I wasn't trapped too? Every decision I made, every lie I told it was survival. He controlled everything. The accounts, the house, the image. I had no way out except to break the image he cared about most, his reputation. I looked at her, feeling my anger twist into something else, understanding, mixed with heartbreak. And now, he's going to destroy you for it. I know, she said. And that's why I need you to listen. You think this is just about his greed, but Susan is part of it. She's been helping him move the money. I saw them arguing the weeks ago, so he accused her of keeping some of it for herself. The revelation hit like a spark. You're saying Susan's stealing from him. I don't know how much my mother said. But whatever she's done, she's terrified he'll find out. She's dangerous when cornered, Nicole. Promise me you won't go after her alone. I stared at her, still trying to reconcile the woman in front of me, the quiet, cautious mother I'd known, with the one who had exposed her husband to the world. You leaked the video, I said again, needing to hear it once more. You started all of this. She nodded slowly. Yes, I didn't mean for it to destroy everything. But maybe it had to. Her words hung between us, heavy and final. I felt my throat tighten as I rose to my feet. You should have trusted me, I said. I know, she whispered, but I didn't even trust myself anymore. I turned toward the door, too full of shock to speak. When I reached for the handle, she said my name softly. Nicole, I looked back at her. She gave a sad, broken smile. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. For a long moment, I couldn't answer. Then, the truth settled in with a weight that seemed to reach the floor. So it was you all along, I said quietly. Her eyes filled again, but she didn't deny it. Yes, she whispered. It was me. And with that, the last fragile thread of what I thought I knew about my family snapped. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until the roads blurred together, the sky turning from black to grey to the dull blue of morning. My thoughts moved in circles, looping back to my mother's tearful face, and the words I couldn't unhear. She had leaked the video, the scandal that shattered everything. But even that truth felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing a piece. There were still questions that didn't fit, especially one that had been growing louder in my mind since the moment I left her house, if my mother had uploaded the video, who had recorded it. By the time I reached the edge of town, I found myself driving toward Emily's new house. She and Michael had postponed their honeymoon after the wedding disaster, though, from what I'd heard, postponed really meant cancelled. The front lawn was littered with half-wilted flowers from guests who hadn't known where else to put them. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment watching the curtains flutter through the window. When I knocked, there was no answer at first. Then the door opened and Emily stood there, her eyes swollen, her voice cautious. Nicole. I nodded. Can I come in? She hesitated, then stepped aside. The house smelled faintly of candles and wine, an attempt to cover the heaviness that hung in the air. The dining table was cluttered with unopened gifts, white boxes wrapped in ribbon that looked out of place in the silence. I heard about what happened, she said finally. With Mum. Of course you did, I said softly. Everyone knows everything these days. She winced, then motioned for me to sit. I didn't. I just came from her, I said. She told me she leaked the video, but she didn't say how she got it. Emily's expression flickered something between guilt and fear. Why does that matter now? Because it doesn't make sense, I said. She couldn't have been near the bar that night, and she's not the one who recorded it. Emily, are you? Her lips parted, but no sound came. Then she sank into a chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I didn't mean for it to turn into this, she whispered. My stomach twisted. You filmed it? She nodded slowly, eyes filling with tears. I saw him, Nicole. I went outside looking for Mum. She'd been feeling sick, and then I saw Dad and Susan. I didn't even think. I just pulled out my phone. I thought if I had proof, Mum would finally believe me. I'd suspected something for months, but every time I tried to tell her, she told me I was imagining things. I sat across from her, trying to absorb it. So you filmed it to protect her? Yes, she said, her voice breaking, but I didn't show anyone. I couldn't. I saved it on my laptop and tried to forget about it. Then, after everything fell apart, the video online, the news, I realised Mum must have found it. She used it to expose him. The air seemed to thin between us. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. So the scandal that destroyed this family, I said quietly, started with you trying to save her. Emily covered her face with her hands. I never wanted this, she said. I just wanted her to see the truth. I looked at her, my little sister, the one who'd always been everyone's favourite, the one I'd thought lived untouched by the things that broke me. But sitting there now, she looked small, fragile, trapped in the same cycle I'd spent my whole life trying to escape. I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. You did what you thought was right, I said. You were trying to protect her. That's not your fault, she shook her head. You don't get it. I watched her defend him for years. The way she flinched when he raised his voice, the way she blamed herself for everything. I thought, if she saw him for what he really was, she'd finally leave. But instead, it just made her hide more. Her words cut deep because they mirrored my own thoughts. Our mother had spent her entire life choosing silence, even when it destroyed her. I used to think staying quiet was strength, I said. But it's just another way of disappearing. Emily lowered her hands, her voice trembling. Do you hate her for what she did? I thought about it. The betrayal still stung, but under it was something heavier, understanding. No, I said finally. I think I understand her more than I ever wanted to. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the truth settling around us like dust. Two daughters of the same broken home, both carrying the same burden of secrets we didn't ask for. For the first time in years, I saw her not as the golden child or the favoured daughter, but as someone who had been just as trapped. Emily reached for my hand. Do you think it's too late for us? She asked softly. Too late for what? For fixing this, for being a family again. I looked at her and thought about everything. We'd lost our mother's trust, our father's respect, the illusion of stability that had held us together for so long. Maybe it's too late to fix what they broke, I said. But it's not too late for us. Tears rolled down her cheeks and she let out a shaky laugh. I don't even know where to start. Start here, I said, by not pretending anymore. She nodded, gripping my hand tighter. I thought if I just stayed quiet, things would get better. But they never do they? I shook my head. No. Silence doesn't heal anything. It just hides the wounds until they bleed again. We sat there crying, softly, our hands clasped between us. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like release. The kind that comes when the truth is finally spoken aloud. When Emily finally looked up, her eyes were red but clear. What are you going to do now? I took a deep breath. Jack and I are still working on exposing Dad's accounts. But now I think there's more to this something about Susan that Mum's too scared to tell us. Emily frowned. You really think Susan's part of it? I know she is, I said, and I'm going to find out how deep it goes. Emily's expression hardened with a quiet kind of resolve. Then, I'm coming with you. I looked at her surprised. Are you sure? She nodded. We've both been quiet long enough. For a long moment, I just held her gaze. The little sister I'd once thought I'd lost was sitting in front of me again, older, wiser, and finally ready to stand beside me. I squeezed her hand. Then let's stop being quiet. For the first time in weeks, those words felt like a promise I could keep. Emily and I spent the night at her house talking until the early hours, piecing together fragments of everything we'd learned. The anger that had once separated us now bound us together in a strange, fragile solidarity. By morning, the weight of it all settled into a single thought. If we wanted the truth, we had to start with Susan. Jack called just after sunrise. I think I found something, he said. His voice was quiet but edged with excitement. You might want to sit down for this. I met him at a cafe near downtown, a small, dim place where the hum of espresso machines drowned out the rest of the world. Jack was already there, his laptop open, a cup of untouched coffee beside him. When I slid into the booth, he turned the screen toward me. I ran a background search on Susan Everett, he said, and it turns out she wasn't always Susan Everett. Her maiden name was Susan Hale. The name tugged at something faint in my memory. Why does that sound familiar? Jack scrolled through an old newspaper clipping. It was dated 34 years ago from our hometown's local paper. Because when your father was 25, Jack said he was engaged to her. My breath caught. What? She disappeared a few months before the wedding. Jack continued. The announcement was retracted, and 3 months later your father married your mother. I stared at the photograph in the clipping. My father looked impossibly young, standing beside a woman with long, dark hair and a shy smile. Susan Hale. Her face was softer then, almost unrecognisable compared to the polished, carefully composed woman I'd grown up calling my mother's best friend. Why didn't anyone ever talk about this? I asked. Because Susan vanished, Jack said. There's no record of her for nearly a year after that engagement was broken. But then, I found something else. He clicked to another document, an archived hospital record. She was admitted under a different name. Complications from a terminated pregnancy. The air around me seemed to still. I leaned back, my pulse echoing in my ears. You're saying my father? Jack nodded. From what I can piece together, she got pregnant. Your father didn't want the scandal. He was just starting his career working for a firm tied to your grandfather's business. A child out of wedlock would have ruined him, so he forced her to end it. I felt my throat tighten. And then he left her for my mother. Exactly, Jack said. Your father moved up, married into your mother's family, and built his empire. Susan disappeared until about 15 years later, right around the time your father started expanding his business again. That's when she came back. New name, new life, and somehow she inserted herself into your mother's circle of friends. I stared at the screen, the pieces beginning to form a picture that made my stomach turn. She came back to destroy him, slowly Jack said, patiently. The kind of revenge that takes decades. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to make sense of it all. The affair, the partnership, the lies, it wasn't just betrayal born of lust or greed. It was something deeper, older, a wound that had never healed. How did my mother never know, I asked. She probably didn't, Jack said. Susan changed everything about her identity. Even the name of the town she listed as her birthplace was fake. But she played it perfectly. Got close enough to your family to make him trust her again, to make her seem harmless. I thought of Susan's laughter at family dinners, the way she would squeeze my mother's hand when they reminisced. I thought of how she'd looked at my father the night of the wedding, intense but not desperate. Calculated. Jack, I said quietly. What if she didn't want to ruin him? What if she wanted him to suffer first? He frowned. What do you mean? She could have exposed him years ago, but instead she waited. She made herself indispensable, his confidant, his cover. She wanted him to believe he'd gotten away with everything, that she'd forgiven him. So when he finally fell, it would hurt more. Jack nodded slowly. That's exactly what I think. The truth of it settled heavily between us. I thought back to the way Susan had looked at me at the wedding, how startled she'd been when I'd caught her with my father. Maybe that moment wasn't shame. Maybe it was something closer to sorrow. "Do you think she ever stopped loving him?" I asked. Jack's expression softened. "That's the thing about people like Susan," he said. "Love and hate don't cancel each other out. They just get tangled until you can't tell which is which." I sat in silence for a long moment, my mind spinning. My father had destroyed one woman's life before marrying another, and now both women were still paying the price for his ambition. My mother had been collateral damage. Susan had become his punishment. "Do you think she ever wanted to hurt us?" I asked quietly. Jack shook his head. "I don't think you were part of her plan." But once the video went public, everything spiraled out of her control. I stood and walked to the window, watching people pass outside. The world went on indifferent to the ruin of one family's secrets. "She's been living two lives," I said softly. "Friend to my mother, lover to my father, enemy to them both. All this time we thought she was just part of the problem, but she was the beginning." Jack closed his laptop and leaned back. "What will you do?" Now I didn't answer right away. I kept thinking about the old photo, the young woman smiling beside a man who would one day betray her. I thought about how grief changes shape over time, how anger turns quiet and settles into the bones. Maybe Susan wasn't evil. Maybe she was just a woman who'd been broken at so long she'd forgotten how to be anything else. Finally, I turned back to Jack. "I need to talk to her," I said. "Not to accuse her, to understand." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Be careful, Nicole. People who've lived in secrets for that long, they don't always know how to tell the truth anymore." I gave a small, tired smile. Neither does anyone in my family. As I walked toward the door, the weight of everything pressed down at once, the lies, the betrayals, the years of silence that had shaped us all. But beneath it, there was something else understanding. Not forgiveness yet, but the beginning of it. I paused before stepping outside and looked back at Jack. "She's not evil," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "Just broken." By the time I left the cafe, the sky had turned heavy with rain. The streets gleamed in the fading light, and every reflection seemed to double back at me, faces, cars, shadows. My mind was still tangled with what I'd learned about Susan, but that confusion was quickly replaced by something colder fear. Because if Jack and I had uncovered that much, then my father had to know we were getting close. And Richard Barnes didn't take kindly to anyone threatening his control. It started the next morning. I found my car parked outside my apartment, the windows smashed, the tyres slashed. The windshield wipers had been bent, upright like broken fingers pointing at the sky. For a moment, I just stood there in the drizzle, numb. My first thought was that it had to be random. Seattle wasn't the safest city and vandalism wasn't unusual. But then, I saw it, the business card, wedged under the wiper, the same type my father's company used, with one word scrawled across the back in black ink. Enough. I called Jack immediately. He didn't answer the first time or the second. When he finally picked up, his voice was tense. "Nicole, I was going to call you. I think we've got a problem." "What kind of problem? I'm being followed," he said. "Grey sedan, same one for the last 2 miles. "Could be coincidence, but it's not," I said. We both went quiet. There was no need to explain. Richard had always been meticulous, the kind of man who knew exactly how to intimidate, without getting his hands dirty. This was his way of sending a message. "I see you. I control this. Back off." That evening I came home to find my email full of alerts. Password reset attempts, unrecognised logins, my bank account flagged for unusual activity. Every digital trace of me was being combed through, picked apart. Someone was inside my life rearranging the pieces. By the next morning, it was Worth. The local news had picked up a story. Disgraced daughter leaks father's private video for fame. My name was plastered across every headline, my photo cropped from old social media posts. The narrative was perfectly shaped, cold, manipulative, opportunistic. My father's PR team had done their job well. I watched the broadcast on mute from my kitchen table, the anchors' mouths moving like synchronized weapons. My phone buzzed endlessly, calls from journalists, messages from old acquaintances pretending to care, strangers calling me names. The worst part wasn't their anger. It was the silence from everyone who mattered. My mother, Emily, even people from work stopped replying. The distance was instant and complete. Jack came by later that afternoon carrying 2 coffees and a face full of worry. He dropped the cups on the table, sat across from me and sighed. "It's bad," he said. I replied flatly. "He's paying PR. Firms, lawyers, maybe even a few editors. They're controlling the story before we can even speak." I rubbed my temples. "So, that's it. He ruins my name and I disappear quietly like everyone else." Jack leaned forward. "That's what he's counting on. He wants you scared and silent." I laughed bitterly. "Then, congratulations to him. It's working." He didn't say anything for a while. The rain outside tapped against the windows like a slow countdown. I could feel my resolve thinning with every drop. I'd spent weeks chasing the truth, digging through rot, only to be dragged back into the same helplessness I'd lived with my whole life. "I thought exposing him would set something right," I said finally. "But all I've done is make everything worse. My mother's terrified, Emily's exhausted, and now I'm a national headline. Maybe he wins by default because he's stronger than I am." Jack's jaw tightened. "That's what he wants you to believe. But don't mistake cruelty for strength." I met his eyes. "You don't get it. He's been playing this game for decades. He knows exactly where to hit. And me, I'm just one person trying to fight someone who's built an empire on lies." Jack stood and walked to the window. "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting alone." He turned back to me. "We'll find allies, legal, financial, maybe even people inside his company who've been burned by him. Every tyrant leaves enemies in his wake." I wanted to believe him, but exhaustion weighed down every word. "Jack, what if there's nothing left to save? What if the damage is already done?" He came closer, crouching beside my chair. "Nicole, look at me." I did. His eyes were steady, determined in a way that reminded me of the person I used to be, the one who still believed truth could win if you fought hard enough. "You told me once that silence destroyed your family," he said. "So don't let it destroy you too. If you walk away now, they win." Something in me flickered a spark, faint but stubborn. I wanted to tell him that I was too tired, that I'd given everything I had. But the truth was, I couldn't stand the thought of my father winning again. Not like this. "I don't even know where to start anymore," I whispered. He stood, offering me his hand. "Start with what he's afraid of most: exposure." "You still have the files, right?" I nodded. "Then we use them. We build our own narrative before his can bury you." I stared at his hand for a long moment before finally taking it. His grip was steady, grounding. The storm outside had grown louder, wind pushing hard against the windows. It sounded like the world itself was trying to remind me of something, that nothing stays quiet forever. Jack squeezed my hand once firm. "He wants you to believe you're powerless. You're not. He's terrified of you, Nicole. That's why he's doing all this." I let out a long, shaky breath. "Then, maybe it's time he remembers why." Jack gave a small, tired smile. "That's more like it." For the first time in days, I felt the faintest pulse of strength. My father could take my reputation, my comfort, even my peace, but he couldn't take my voice. Not anymore. I looked out at the rain, the streetlights flickering against the glass. "If you walk away now, they win," Jack had said. The words stayed with me, steadying me against the storm. And for the first time in a long time, I had no intention of walking away. The storm didn't stop that night. Rain came down in long, angry sheets, beating against the windows as if the sky itself were trying to drown out every plan we were about to make. Jack stayed, his jacket draped over a chair, his laptop open on the kitchen table. The glow from the screen made the shadows dance across the room, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel entirely alone. We sat across from each other in silence for a while, both of us too aware of the weight of what we were about to do. My father had stripped away my job, my reputation, and nearly every ounce of credibility I had left. But he hadn't taken the one thing he couldn't control: proof. Jack broke the silence first. If we're going to do this, we have to be smart. No leaks, no digital trails. He's watching everything. I nodded. We catch himself saying it. His words, his voice, his confession. Jack leaned back thinking. That's not impossible, but it's dangerous. We'd have to get Susan and Richard in the same room on record. And if they suspect anything... They won't, I said. They trust each other too much. That's their weakness. He raised an eyebrow. And what's yours? I hesitated, staring down at my hands, still wanting to believe people can change. Jack didn't respond right away. He just looked at me long enough for me to know he understood more than he said. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small black device. This records audio and video, high resolution encrypted. If you can get it close enough, it'll capture everything. I picked it up carefully. It was lighter than I expected, no bigger than a pen. Where did you get this? Don't ask, he said with a faint smile. Let's just say journalism isn't as quiet a profession as people think. I turned it over in my hands. The idea of using it terrified me, but so did doing nothing. So how do we get them talking? Jack stood pacing slowly as he thought it through. Susan's been skittish lately, right? If she feels Richard might betray her, or that you know more than you do, she'll want reassurance. You give her a reason to confront him. I frowned. So I play the messenger. Feed her something that forces them to meet. Exactly. Tell her you found something, maybe a document showing Richard's transfers to her name. Make it sound like he's planning to pin it all on her. If she believes that she'll go straight to him. And when she does, I finished, we'll have the recorder waiting. Jack nodded. We just need to know where and when. I sat back, the weight of it all pressing down hard. The plan made too much sense, but the thought of facing either of them again made my skin crawl. I hadn't seen my father since the night of the wedding, since the slap that had marked the end of whatever illusion of family we'd ever had. The idea of standing in front of him again, pretending to be the same obedient daughter, felt almost impossible. Jack seemed to sense my hesitation. You don't have to face him directly, he said gently. Let me handle the technical side. You just focus on getting Susan to bite. But deep down, I knew I'd have to face him. Every piece of this led back to him. Every lie, every scar, every silence. I'll do it, I said finally. If this is the only way to end it, I'll do whatever it takes. Jack's expression softened to pride and worry tangled in equal measure. You sound just like your mother when you say that. The comparison caught me off guard. I'm not her, I said quickly. I didn't mean it as an insult, he said. She's stronger than she knows. You both are. I looked away, swallowing hard. My mother's silence had always felt like weakness, but now I could see the truth behind it. She'd been surviving in her own way. But I wasn't going to survive. I was going to fight. We spent the next few hours refining every detail, timing backup copies, safe locations for the files. Jack walked me through the recorder's operation twice, then 3 times, until I could handle it with my eyes closed. Every plan had to be airtight because one mistake meant giving my father everything he wanted: silence. By the time we finished, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle and the sky was beginning to lighten. Jack leaned back in his chair, exhausted but alert. You know, once this starts, there's no going back. I know, I said quietly. That's the point. He gave a small approving nod. Then it settled. We move fast. You reach out to Susan. I'll set up the recording system near wherever they meet. We'll get him. The words sounded too good, too dangerous. And yet I felt a strange calm wash over me. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting to what my father did. I was choosing my own move. As Jack gathered his things, I stood by the window watching the early morning light creep across the wet streets. The world looked washed clean, almost peaceful, but I knew better. Peace wasn't something people like my father allowed. It had to be fought for, taken back inch by inch. I turned back to Jack. No more silence, I said firmly. No more waiting for justice. We make it happen. He smiled faintly. That's the woman who's going to win. After he left, I sat alone at the table for a long time, staring at the small recording device in my hand. It felt heavier now, like it carried the weight of everything this family had buried. I thought of my mother, my sister, even Susan, all of us bound by the same man's lies. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about ending the cycle that had kept us all quiet for too long. I opened my laptop and began composing a message to Susan, just a few words calculated enough to provoke without revealing too much. We need to talk. It's about Richard. I know what he's planning. Meet me. I hesitated over the send button, feeling my pulse quicken. Once I pressed it, there would be no turning back. Before I could second-guess myself, my phone vibrated. I glanced down and froze. It wasn't Susan. It was my father. The message was short, clinical, every word cutting through me like glass. We need to talk. Alone. My fingers went cold as I stared at the screen. Somehow, he already knew. The message on my phone burned like a warning. We need to talk. Alone. My first instinct was fear, the kind that makes your throat tighten and your hands go cold. My father's words had never been casual, never simply conversational. They were orders, veiled threats, and sometimes, like now, both. I read the message 3 times before I forced myself to breathe. He knew. Somehow he knew something was happening. Whether it was about Susan or the investigation or the video, I couldn't tell. But the timing was too precise to be coincidence. Jack wasn't answering his phone when I called. I left a message, short, calm, but urgent. He wants to meet. I'm going. If I don't answer in an hour, you'll know where to find me. When I arrived at the house, the lights inside were dim. My father's black sedan sat in the driveway like a sentinel, sleek and silent. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, gripping the small recording device in my hand. It was already armed, hidden under the lining of my coat. My pulse pounded in my ears. I reminded myself what Jack had said the night before. His weakness is control. Make him think he still has it. When I knocked, the door opened almost instantly. My father stood there, perfectly composed in his pressed shirt and tie, as though nothing in the world had ever touched him. "Nicole," he said evenly, "you're late." "I didn't know this was an appointment," I replied. His lips curved in something that might have been a smile, though it never reached his eyes. "Everything with me is an appointment. Come in." The living room looked different now, cleaner, colder, like a stage set for a play no one wanted to watch. The photographs on the mantel were gone, the family portraits replaced with abstract art and glass sculptures. My mother's presence had been erased completely. "I thought we should clear the air," he said, motioning for me to sit. I stayed standing. "You mean after you tried to ruin my life?" He gave a soft, practiced laugh. "You've been busy, stirring up trouble, spreading lies. I had to protect the family's reputation." "By destroying mine?" "By maintaining order," he corrected. "You've always been impulsive, emotional. This little crusade of yours, whatever it is, ends now." I stared at him, the calmness in his tone more unnerving than anger. "You can't control the truth, Dad. Not this time." He poured himself a drink and took a slow sip. "Truth," he said, almost amused. "Do you even know what that means anymore? You've been listening to the wrong people. Jack Harris, perhaps, or your mother in one of her hysterical fits." "You forged her signature," I said quietly. "You stole from her." For a moment, the glass paused at his lips. Then he set it down with care. "I don't know what nonsense you've been told, but you're making a grave mistake." "No," I said, "I'm correcting one." Before he could answer, the sound of heels clicking on the hardwood floor made us both turn. Susan stepped into the room, elegant as ever, wearing a dark coat and an unreadable expression. "Richard," she said softly, "you didn't tell me she'd be here." "I didn't think I needed to," he replied. It seems everyone's been making decisions for me lately. Susan glanced at me, her eyes sharp, but not unkind. You shouldn't have come, Nicole. I'm not the one who's hiding, I said. My father's jaw tightened. That's enough. Whatever fantasy you and your little friend have created ends here. Do you understand? I didn't answer. Instead, I shifted slightly, letting the coat's fabric fall just right, so the device's microphone would catch every word. Jack had told me this would be the moment, the confrontation, the breaking point. Susan's gaze lingered on me for a moment before she turned to Richard. She knows, doesn't she? Richard's voice hardened. Knows what about the accounts, she said quietly. About what you've been doing with Margaret's trust. He stared at her, and for the first time I saw something unfamiliar in his expression, uncertainty. Be careful what you say, Susan. She took a slow breath, her composure wavering. I kept your secrets for years, Richard. I watched you lie to your wife, your daughters, everyone. But now everything's falling apart. Maybe it's time you admit what you did. I stepped closer. Go ahead, I said softly. Tell him. He turned on me, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know what you're talking about. But Susan didn't stop. He moved the money offshore, she said. Used Margaret's name, her identification, her trust. I helped him hide it. I thought I was taking back what he owed me, but I see now it was never about justice. It was about control. Richard's eyes went wide. You stupid woman, he hissed. Do you know what you've just done? Susan straightened, tears shining in her eyes, but her voice steady. I loved you once. You destroyed that. You destroyed everything. He lunged toward her so suddenly that I barely had time to react. The glass shattered against the floor, the sound sharp and violent. You think you can turn on me now, he roared. Dad, stop, I shouted, stepping between them. For a second, his rage flickered toward me, pure and unfiltered. His hand rose too fast, too familiar, but this time I didn't back away. Go ahead, I said. Hit me again. Let's make sure the world sees exactly who you are. That was when Jack burst through the door. I hadn't even heard the car, but suddenly he was there, pulling Richard back, shouting for me to move. Nicole, get out. I stumbled backward, the chaos collapsing into a blur of shouting and breaking glass. Susan was crying now, trembling, her voice cracking as she said, He'll kill us both. Jack shoved Richard back hard, his own voice shaking with fury. You're done. Barnes, it's over. My father's chest heaved. He looked at each of us. The daughter he couldn't control, the woman he'd betrayed. The man who stood between them, and something dark crossed his face. Not fear. Something deeper. Something that promised this wasn't finished. He straightened his jacket, his voice dropping to a low growl. You think you can destroy me? I met his gaze, my heart pounding but steady. No, I said. You did that yourself. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his lips curled into a smile that made my blood run cold. You'll regret this, he said softly. Both of you. And then he walked out, calm as ever, leaving the wreckage of his own life scattered behind him. For a moment, after he left, there was only silence, the kind that follows an explosion. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the smell of whiskey and fear. Susan sat trembling on the edge of the couch, shards of broken glass scattered at her feet. Jack stood near the door, his chest still rising and falling fast, watching to make sure Richard didn't come back. And I just stood there, staring at the place where my father had been wondering how something could end and begin at the same time. We had the recording. His voice. Susan's confession, the rage that tore through his mask of respectability, it was all there. Proof of everything. Jack picked up the device from where I had dropped on my coat and checked the indicator light. It was still blinking, still capturing every breath, every word. We've got him, he said quietly. This is enough to bury him. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. But it didn't last long. By the next morning, the world had turned upside down again. My phone buzzed non-stop calls, messages, notifications from numbers I didn't recognize. The headlines were already spreading across every news site, Greedy daughter blackmails father for millions. At first, I thought it was just another smear attempt, more rumours from his PR machine. But then I saw the screenshots emails supposedly sent from my account to Richards demanding money in exchange for silence. The words looked real. The timestamps matched perfectly with the dates of our confrontation and the video leak. My father had forged everything, turned the entire story on its head, and the world believed him. Jack stormed into my apartment not long after. His tie was loose, his hair dishevelled, and he looked more furious than I'd ever seen him. He moved faster than we thought, he said, tossing his phone on the table. He had this ready. The fake emails, the statements, it's all orchestrated. I opened my laptop and scrolled through the stories. They were brutal. Ungrateful daughter exploits family scandal. Interior designer Nicole Barnes exposed for extortion scheme. My inbox was full of hate. Former clients were cancelling contracts. Friends unfollowed me. Even my old firm had issued a public statement disassociating from recent controversies. I can't work, I said softly. They're blacklisting me. Jack rubbed his temples. He's trying to isolate you. It's what people like him do. Destroy the support first, then crush what's left. I thought the truth would protect me, I whispered. Jack gave a humorless laugh. Truth doesn't matter when one side owns the microphones. I sank into the chair, staring at the headlines until the words blurred. It was happening again, the same story rewritten by his hand, and I was the villain this time. The obedient daughter turned traitor. The one who betrayed her father for money. He'd taken the narrative and moulded it until it fit the version of me he needed the world to hate. Susan had gone into hiding. Jack said she was terrified, afraid Richard would come after her next. My mother wouldn't answer my calls. Emily texted once, just one line, I don't know what to believe anymore. That hurt more than anything. By evening, reporters had gathered outside my building. Cameras, microphones, people shouting my name. I pulled the curtains closed, trying to block them out, but their voices seeped through. Nicole, do you regret blackmailing your father? Are you cooperating with investigators? Is it true you leaked the video for money? The noise felt endless. Each shout chipped away at the small piece of strength I had left. Jack called from the street. Don't talk to anyone, he said. I'll be there soon. I don't think I can do this, I admitted, my voice shaking. He's winning, Jack. Again, you can't think like that, he said firmly. You have the recording. We'll get it authenticated. We'll prove everything. But even if we do, I said, it won't matter. The world already picked a side. Jack paused. Then we'll change their minds. One truth at a time. When he arrived, he slipped through the back entrance to avoid the crowd. His coat was soaked from the rain, and he carried a small brown envelope under his arm. Someone dropped this at my office, he said. No return address. I looked up from the couch. What is it? I don't know yet, he said, setting it on the table. But it was marked urgent. And whoever sent it knew what we're doing. My assistant said the messenger asked for me by name. I frowned, glancing at the envelope. The paper was thick, old-fashioned, sealed with a smear of wax instead of tape. My name wasn't written anywhere on it. Just one word, evidence. Do you think it's a trap, I asked. Could be, Jack said, or it could be exactly what we need. For a long time, neither of us moved. The rain outside had turned into a steady rhythm against the windows, and the noise from the reporters below was fading. The envelope sat between us, like a heartbeat. Jack finally reached for it, sliding a knife gently under the seal. Inside was a single flash drive and a folded note. He read it silently, his eyes narrowing as he did. What does it say? I asked. He looked up at me slowly, his voice quiet but tight. It says, "You're not the only one he fooled." I stared at the drive, feeling the weight of it before I even touched it. Who sent it? There's no signature, he said, but whoever it is, they know about Richard's operation. Maybe even more than we do. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days, hope thin and trembling but real. Then we open it, I said. Jack hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting my father to burst in at any moment. If this is real, it could change everything. But once we look at it, there's no going back. I met his gaze, the noise of the world fading around us. We crossed that line the moment we hit record. He nodded, slowly slid the drive into his laptop, and the screen lit up with a single folder titled Barnes Confidential. We exchanged one last look before opening it, unaware that what waited inside wouldn't just expose my father's crimes, it would uncover something far worse. When Jack double-clicked the folder labelled Barnes Confidential, the laptop screen filled with scanned documents. Some typed, some handwritten, some marked with red seals that looked almost official. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the computer and the distant rain against the glass. Then Jack leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "These look like legal files," he murmured. "Old ones." He opened the first document. Across the top, typed in faded ink, were the words "Last Will and Testament of Henry Barnes," my grandfather, the man whose name still hung like a shadow over the family. I frowned, confused. Why would someone send us this? Jack scrolled slowly through the pages. The will was dated almost 25 years ago, about a year before my grandfather's death. There were signatures at the bottom, his 2 witnesses, and a notary seal. Jack clicked to the next page, his expression tightening. "Look at this section," he said, pointing. I leaned over. It was a list of beneficiaries. My mother's name was there, as was mine, Emily's too. The estate was divided fairly among us all, with one note written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. To my granddaughter, Nicole, who carries the strength of her grandmother, I leave the farmhouse and a portion of the family trust. My throat tightened. The farmhouse, the same one I had visited weeks earlier, trying to remember what peace had felt like. It had been meant for me. Jack scrolled further, opening another file, one dated a year later after my grandfather's death. This one was different. The language was more formal, the signature slightly altered. The notary seal was faint, almost smudged, and where the beneficiaries were listed, only one name remained. Richard Barnes. I stared at the screen, my voice barely a whisper. He changed it. Jack nodded grimly. He didn't just change it, Nicole. He forged it. Look, different typewriter model, different ink density, even the signature alignment is off. Whoever sent this knew exactly what's to show us. The realization settled over me slowly like a fog thickening until I could barely breathe. My father hadn't just stolen from my mother. He'd stolen from all of us. From me. From my sister. From his own family legacy. "He must have replaced the original after your grandfather died," Jack said. "Filed the fake one with the estate lawyer, destroyed the evidence, and no one ever questioned it." I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "That's why we never had anything," I said softly. "Why he always acted like everything belonged to him, like we were just guests in his world." Jack nodded. "He built his empire on a lie. Your grandfather wanted you to have something of your own. He made sure of it. But Richard, he erased you from the story." My eyes burned as I looked at the document again, the careful ink strokes of a man I barely remembered. My grandfather had always been quiet, stern, but kind in his own way. I remembered sitting on his lap as a child, while he told me that fairness was the only thing that kept a family from eating itself alive. And yet here it was proof that his own son had betrayed that principle entirely. "He always told me the farmhouse wasn't mine," I said. "That it was too much for me to handle, that I wouldn't know what to do with something that valuable." He made it sound like I wasn't capable. But it was mine. It was always mine. Jack looked at me carefully. "This explains more than just the money, doesn't it?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing through memories I hadn't thought about in years. Every dismissal, every cruel comment, every time my father had praised Emily and ignored me. "He hated me for it," I said, Not because I disappointed him, but because I reminded him of the truth he buried. The one person who could have called him out was gone, and I was what was left. He didn't just want to erase me from his will, he wanted to erase me from his conscience. Jack exhaled slowly. It's always about power with men like him. Money's just how they keep score. I closed the laptop, my reflection flickering faintly in the dark screen. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about the pattern, what he's been doing his entire life. The lies, the manipulation, the control. He stole from his father, then from my mother. He used Susan. And now he's trying to destroy me the same way. Jack's voice softened. And now you finally have the proof that it started long before you ever got caught in it. I leaned back, feeling the full weight of it settle in. This rot started long before me, I said quietly. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. They hung in the air, heavy and final, because that was the truth of it. This wasn't just my fight. It was the echo of every silence that came before me, every wrong buried under the illusion of family loyalty. My grandfather's will wasn't just a legal document. It was a map of everything my father had taken and every line he'd crossed to keep his power intact. Jack looked at me for a long time, the faint hum of the rain filling the space between us. Nicole, he said finally, this changes everything. If we take this to the authorities, it's not just fraud. It's inheritance, theft, forgery, and perjury. He could lose everything, his company, his assets, maybe even his freedom. I stared at the laptop, my mind turning over the possibilities. For years, my father had made me feel powerless. But now, for the first time, the power was mine. Proof he couldn't twist or deny. I took a deep breath and stood. Then we don't wait, I said. We move now. We take this to the lawyer who handled the estate. If he's still alive, he'll know the difference. Jack nodded. I'll make the calls. As he reached for his phone, I walked to the window. The city lights shimmered through the rain, distorted but steady, and I saw something in their reflection that I hadn't seen in myself for a long time, clarity. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth, about pulling every rotten piece of this family's legacy into the light and finally ending it. I turned back to Jack, my voice firm. He took everything from everyone he ever loved. It's time someone took something back. Jack smiled faintly. Now that sounds like the Nicole I remember. I didn't answer. I just looked back at the storm outside and whispered again, more to myself than to him. This rot started long before me. When the storm finally cleared the next morning, the world outside looked strangely calm. The streets shimmered with leftover rain, and for a moment, everything seemed cleaner, softer, as if the city itself had washed away some of its grime. But inside me, the storm hadn't passed. Jack was already at his desk making calls to lawyers and investigators preparing to file what he called the first real blow. I stood by the window, my thoughts drifting to my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the confrontation with my father. Every part of me wanted to stay angry, to let the betrayal sit heavy between us. But the discovery of my grandfather's will had changed something. I understood now that my father's cruelty wasn't random. It was inherited, passed down like a sickness. My mother hadn't created this silence, she had simply lived inside it. And I realised she needed someone to help her out of it. So that afternoon, I drove back to her house. The driveway was empty, except for her old sedan, parked crookedly as always. When I knocked, she didn't answer right away. But then the door creaked open, and there she was, smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a faded cardigan, her eyes tired but clear. "Nicole," she said softly. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside, and I entered the house that used to feel like a home. It smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish, the same as when I was a child, though now the scent seemed to mask something else fierce. The silence was thick, pressing against every wall. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she used to pack my lunches before school. She folded her hands in front of her, waiting. I found something, I said, sliding the printed copy of the original will across the table. She looked down at it, confusion furrowing her brow. Then slowly, as she read, her eyes widened. "This is your grandfather's handwriting," she whispered. I nodded. "The real will. He left everything to you, to me, to Emily. But Richard forged a new one after he died. He made it look like he was the sole heir." Her hand went to her mouth, trembling. He stole it." "Yes," I said. "All of it. The company, the estate, the money. Everything he built was based on this lie." For a long time she didn't speak. The ticking of the kitchen clock filled the silence. When she finally looked up, her face was pale but resolute. "I knew he was cruel," she said, "but I never knew how far he'd go. I thought he was just angry, broken by the pressure of success. I told myself he loved us in his own way. But this," she trailed off, shaking her head, "this was never love." I reached across the table, resting my hand on hers. "Mum, you don't have to carry this anymore. You can make it right." Her eyes filled with tears. "What can I do? What difference would it make now you can testify?" I said gently. "You can tell the truth. About the forged will, about the accounts, about everything he made you sign. You're the only one who can." She flinched at the word testify, her hand tightening around mine. "You don't understand what that means. He'll destroy me." "He already tried," I said softly. "And yet, you're still here." She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching mine. "You sound just like him when you say things like that," she said quietly. "I'm nothing like him," I said, though part of me wondered if she was right. The determination, the refusal to back down, it came from somewhere. She sighed, her gaze dropping back to the papers. "When I married your father, I thought I was escaping something small. My family was poor. He offered stability, protection. But what I didn't realize was that I was trading one kind of prison for another. And when I had you girls, I told myself the silence was for your sake. That if I stayed quiet, at least you'd have a roof over your heads." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her chest. "But it only taught you both to hide, to shrink." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You did what you thought you had to do." "I did what I was afraid to do," she corrected softly. "I wanted to argue, to tell her she was being too hard on herself. But she wasn't wrong. She'd lived her whole life in someone else's shadow, and the only way out now was to step into the light." After a long silence, she reached for the will again, her fingers tracing my grandfather's signature. "He always said Richard was too ambitious," she murmured. "Said one day it would eat him alive. I didn't believe it then. Do you believe it now?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. And I won't let it eat me anymore either." Her words caught me off guard. "What are you saying?" She met my eyes, and for the first time in years, there was strength there. "I'm saying I'll testify." I stared at her, unsure I'd heard correctly. "Mum, are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "If I stay silent any longer, then he wins." "You were right, Nicole. This silence, it's poisoned everything. It's time to break it." The tears came before I could stop them. I reached across the table again, this time pulling her hand into mine. "Thank you," I whispered. "You don't know what this means." She smiled faintly. "I think I do." "You gave me my voice back." I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. "You always had it. You just forgot what it sounded like." We sat like that for a while, hand in hand, the years of distance melting away in the quiet. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like a wall between us, it felt like peace. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. The afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, painting the yard in warm gold. She looked at me with a strange mix of pride and fear. "You know, he won't go down easily," she said. "I know," I said. "But this time, he's not just fighting me." She nodded, her voice low. "No, he's fighting the truth." A few days later, while Jack and I were finalising the documents for the court hearing, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. It came. Attached was a picture, a crisp white envelope with the court's seal stamped across it. I stared at the image for a long time, my chest tightening. The summons, the first official step toward justice. My mother was going to testify, and for the first time in my life, I believed we might actually win. I held on to that belief for exactly 3 days. 3 days where hope began to take the shape of something solid. Court dates, affidavits, witness lists. Jack was cautiously optimistic, saying we had enough to make Richard bleed on paper. My mother had started speaking to me every evening, her voice steadier each time. She even sounded lighter, almost like she was remembering what freedom felt like. But on the 4th day, everything shifted again. It started with a phone call from my mother, her tone strange, too calm. "Nicole," she said softly, "your father's lawyer came to see me." I was in Jack's office when she said it, surrounded by stacks of documents and the dull buzz of fluorescent lights. I froze mid-sentence, the words catching in my throat. "What?" "Why, he said Richard wants to make things right," she continued. "He said if I sign a statement clearing him of wrongdoing, he'll protect you. He promised you wouldn't be dragged through the trial." Jack immediately straightened, motioning for me to put the call on speaker. "Mum," I said slowly, "what kind of statement?" Her voice wavered. "A confession. He wants me to say I handled the finances on my own, that I created the offshore accounts without his knowledge." Jack cursed under his breath. I gripped the phone tighter. "And you believe him?" She hesitated. He sounded sincere. "He said if I take responsibility, he'll make sure you don't lose your career, that the press will stop." "Mom, no," I said firmly. "It's a trap." Jack leaned forward, whispering, "Ask where he is. Ask who delivered it." I took a breath. "Where did you meet his lawyer?" "At the house," she said quietly. "He said Richard wanted it to be private." Jack's eyes met mine, sharp and knowing. "We need to record this," he mouthed. "Mum," I said gently, forcing my voice steady, "I'm coming over. Don't sign anything. Not yet." When we arrived, my mother's car was in the driveway, and through the front window I could see her sitting at the dining table with a mason in a dark suit. I recognised him immediately, Paul Henley, my father's corporate attorney. I'd seen him before, always standing just behind Richard, like a shadow. Jack and I parked a few houses down. He handed me a small audio recorder and adjusted his phone's live stream setting. "If this goes how I think it will, we'll have what we need," he said. "But you have to stay calm." Inside, the air was tense and still. My mother looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of guilt and relief. Paul's polite smile faltered the moment he saw me. "Nicole," he said, standing quickly, "this is a private matter between your parents. I am part of this family too," I said. "So whatever you're asking her to sign, you can explain it to me." He cleared his throat, the lawyer's mask slipping slightly. "Your father only wants to avoid unnecessary embarrassment for everyone involved. If Margaret signs this, all charges will be dismissed and your names will stay out of the papers." "And what happens to my mother?" I asked. He didn't meet my eyes. "She accepts minimal responsibility, a fine community service perhaps. It will be handled discreetly." I looked at the papers spread before her. They were printed neatly on firm white stock, her name already typed at the bottom, waiting for a signature. I recognised the phrasing, carefully constructed legal traps that sounded harmless but meant destruction. "Mum," I said softly, "please tell me you didn't sign anything." She shook her head, but her eyes glistened. "I thought about it," she whispered. "He said it would save you. I can't stand to see you suffer for my mistakes." I knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You're not the one who made mistakes. He is, and he's doing it again right now. Don't let him use you to clean up his mess." Paul shifted uncomfortably. "Nicole, you should leave this to the adults. Your emotions are clouding." "What's clouding?" I cut him off, standing. You mean interfering with your client's crimes? Jack stepped forward, his phone still recording discreetly in his hand. Mr. Henley, he said coolly, you're aware this kind of coercion is illegal, correct? Pressuring a witness into signing a false statement. I believe the Bar Association would be interested. Paul paled. You have no idea what you're accusing me of. Don't worry, Jack said, his tone casual but sharp. We'll let the tape speak for itself. Paul froze. Tape? I smiled slightly, pulling the small recorder from my pocket. You didn't think I came here unprepared, did you? For the first time, the calm veneer cracked. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating. This conversation is privileged. You can't use... This isn't privilege, Jack interrupted. It's witness intimidation. My mother looked between us, stunned. You were recording? Yes, I said softly. To protect you. I couldn't let him do this again. Paul's composure disintegrated. You don't understand, he snapped. Richard's desperate. He's losing everything. If she doesn't help him, he'll what? I asked quietly. Ruin us. He already tried. Paul's mouth opened, then closed again. He gathered the papers hastily, shoving them into his briefcase. This will come back to haunt you, he muttered before heading for the door. Tell my father I called after him that his threats don't work anymore. When the door slammed shut, the silence that followed was deafening. My mother sat back in her chair, trembling. I can't believe he would do that, she whispered. I thought I knew the worst of him. I placed the recorder on the table. You've spent your whole life believing what he wanted you to. But now, everyone will hear the truth. Jack nodded. We have enough now to charge not just Richard, but his entire legal team. He tried to fabricate evidence. That's obstruction, intimidation, serious time. My mother looked at me, tears spilling freely now. You shouldn't have had to do this for me. I didn't do it for you, I said, though my voice softened as I said it. I did it for both of us. She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. You've grown into everything he was afraid you'd be, she said. I swallowed the lump in my throat and managed a small, weary smile. And what's that unafraid? Jack was already packing up the equipment, making notes for the legal team. But as he worked, I caught something in his expression, a small, knowing smile. What is it? I asked. He looked up. You said earlier you thought we might actually win. Well, now we have proof that we already are. I glanced toward the door where Paul had stood, my father's words echoing faintly in my mind. You'll regret this. But as I looked at my mother calm and resolute beside me, I realized something had shifted. The fear that had ruled us for decades was gone. The trap my father had set to destroy us had just begun to close around him. The morning of the trial, the air in the courthouse felt thick, almost electric, charged with the weight of everything that had led us there. Reporters filled the steps outside their cameras, flashing like a relentless storm, as Jack and I helped my mother inside. She clutched my arm tightly, her hand trembling but her chin was lifted high. Margaret Barnes, the woman who had once lived in silence, was about to speak louder than she ever had in her life. The courtroom itself felt cold, the walls too white, the light too harsh. On one side, Richard sat with his lawyers perfectly groomed, as always wearing that same mask of control. His jaw was set, his expression calm, almost bored. But his eyes, those eyes I'd known all my life, were restless. They darted between the judge, the jury, and me, calculating, measuring, searching for an escape that no longer existed. I sat behind my mother close enough that she could feel my presence if she faltered. Jack was beside me, his notebook open, his recorder, discreetly tucked away. Across the aisle sat Susan. I hadn't seen her since the confrontation weeks ago. She looked older, now her elegance dimmed by exhaustion, but there was a quiet strength in her posture, a woman who had already lived through her punishment and was finally ready to tell the truth. The first part of the proceedings was procedural motions, objections, exhibits, entered into evidence. But then came the testimony. My mother was called first. I watched as she stood, adjusted her cardigan, and made her way to the witness stand. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. When she spoke, her voice was soft at first, but steady. "My name is Margaret Barnes," she began. "I was married to Richard Barnes for 37 years. And for most of those years, I believed the silence between us was safety. I thought keeping quiet protected my family." Her hands were clasped tightly on the rail in front of her. But silence only protected him. The room stirred. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. She described the years of manipulation, the financial lies, the forged documents, the fear that kept her obedient. She told them about the offshore accounts, about being tricked into signing papers she didn't understand. When the prosecutor asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, she hesitated only briefly. "Because I was afraid," she said, "and because he taught me that fear was love." I felt something inside me shift as she spoke. The courtroom wasn't just hearing a statement, it was hearing decades of buried truth being unearthed one word at a time. My father didn't look at her as she spoke. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, his hand motionless over his pen. But the stillness was unnatural brittle. When the defense cross-examined her, they tried to paint her as confused, manipulated by me and Jack. My mother didn't flinch. She met the lawyer's gaze and said simply, "The only person who ever manipulated me was my husband." Her voice didn't shake once. When she stepped down, I caught her eye and smiled through tears I hadn't realized were there. She gave me a small nod before returning to her seat, her shoulders lighter somehow, as if speaking had freed her. Then they called Susan. She walked to the stand without looking at Richard. For the first time since I'd known her, there was no performance, no charm, no practiced grace. Just honesty, raw and trembling. "I knew Richard Barnes when I was 22, she began. "We were engaged. I thought he was the love of my life. But when I became pregnant, he told me it would ruin his future. He made me end it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I glanced at my father. His face remained expressionless, but his fingers tightened around his pen until his knuckles went white. Susan continued, "I disappeared for years. I thought I could move on, but I never did. When I returned, I found him married to Margaret. I thought I could forgive him by being her friend, but I didn't want forgiveness. I wanted him to feel what I had felt. So I helped him hide his money, thinking I was helping him destroy himself. Instead, I became just like him, complicit." Her voice cracked. "I'm here to tell the truth now, because the only person who deserves to be ruined by Richard Barnes is Richard Barnes." By the time she finished, the room was silent. Even the defense team seemed subdued. It wasn't just testimony anymore. It was confession, redemption, the unraveling of every lie Richard had ever built. The prosecutor presented the evidence. Next, the forged will, the recorded coercion attempt, the hidden accounts. Each piece landed like a hammer strike. And with every blow, my father's mask slipped a little further. When the recording of Paul Henley's visit to my mother played, Richard's composure finally cracked. His face flushed red, his jaw tightening as the audio filled the room, his lawyer's voice offering false promises, my mother's hesitation, my own words cutting through it all. "Don't let him use you to clean up his mess." The defense objected, of course, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it, the press had heard it, there was no going back. When it was finally my father's turn to speak, he refused to testify. He sat there staring straight ahead, his hands folded neatly, every inch the proud man who still believed he could outlast the truth. But there was nothing left to defend. His kingdom had been built on deceit, and now every brick was crumbling in public view. I watched him closely, searching for something: remorse, anger, even recognition. But what I saw instead was emptiness. The same emptiness that had lived in our house all those years, disguised as discipline, disguised as love. As the proceedings drew to a close for the day, the judge dismissed everyone until morning. The bailiff began to escort Richard out, and that was when he finally looked at me. Just one glance, sharp and cold. But for the first time, there was no power behind it. He looked defeated. My mother stood beside me, her hand finding mine. Susan sat quietly in the back, her eyes downcast, her own ghosts finally at rest. Jack leaned close and whispered, "It's over, Nicole. He's finished." But I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter, heavier. The kind of closure that hurts before it heals. As Richard passed by, his head bowed, the light from the courtroom window caught on the grey in his hair. For a second, I didn't see the monster I'd spent my life fearing. I saw a man who had spent decades running from his own sins until they caught him. And then, for the first time in my life, I saw him hang his head. The next morning, the courthouse was quieter than it had been in weeks. The crowds outside were smaller, the cameras fewer, as though the story that had consumed the town was finally beginning to fade. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The jury had deliberated for nearly 6 hours the night before, and now everyone had gathered again to hear their decision. I sat between Jack and my mother, hands clasped in my lap, my pulse thudding steadily in my ears. My father sat a few rows ahead, flanked by his lawyers. He hadn't turned around once since the testimony ended. His shoulders, once so straight, now slumped slightly. The crisp lines of his tailored suit couldn't disguise the exhaustion that had taken hold of him. I wondered if he'd slept at all, or if he'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the wreckage of his life. The bailiff called for silence. The judge entered expression unreadable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreman stood a folded sheet of paper, trembling slightly in his hand. "We have, Your Honour." The courtroom went still. On the charge of financial fraud, the foreman read, "We find the defendant Richard Barnes guilty." A low murmur swept through the room, hushed almost immediately by the bailiff's sharp command for order. My mother gasped softly beside me, her hand finding mine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. On the charge of coercion and witness intimidation, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant, Richard Barnes, guilty." The words seemed to echo off the walls. For a moment, everything inside me went silent. The years of fear, anger, resentment, all of it muted by the weight of what I had just heard. My father, the man who had controlled every room he'd ever entered, had finally lost control. The judge nodded solemnly. "Mr. Barnes, you are hereby convicted on both counts. Sentencing will be set at a later date." She turned toward him. "Do you have anything you wish to say to the court?" Richard stood slowly. When he spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. "I have nothing to say," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "But you'll regret believing them." The judge's gavel struck once sharp and final. "That's enough, Mr. Barnes." He was escorted out moments later, his wrists bound loosely in silver cuffs. As he passed our row, he didn't look at me. His gaze stayed fixed ahead, the same as it always had. But I could feel it, the emptiness behind his silence. The power he'd wielded for so long had drained away, leaving only a hollow man in its place. When the door closed behind him, my mother exhaled the sound, breaking into a quiet sob. I turned to her, but she was smiling through her tears. "It's over," she whispered. Jack rested a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "You brought the truth into the light." I shook my head, my voice barely audible. "We did it?" Susan's sentencing came later that afternoon. She stood before the judge, her face pale but composed. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she nodded once. "I don't ask for forgiveness," she said quietly. "I ask for understanding. I lived in silence for 30 years because I was afraid of him. And when I stopped being afraid, I became cruel instead. That's not freedom either. I hope the people he hurt, especially this family, can find peace where I couldn't." Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. The judge sentenced her to probation and community service, citing her cooperation and the evidence she had provided. Susan thanked the court, then walked out without looking back. I didn't see her again after that. Jack said she'd left town the next day, disappearing quietly into another life. There was something fitting about that her story closing, not with punishment, but with quiet exile. She had spent too long chasing ghosts to live among them anymore. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and clear. The reporters were waiting, of course, their cameras already turning toward me as I stepped down the stone steps. Someone shouted, "Nicole, do you feel vindicated?" Another called out, "What will you do now that it's over?" I didn't answer. Jack motioned for them to give space. His presence a steady shield beside me. But even through the noise, I could hear snippets of what people were saying. "The daughter who broke the silence," one reporter murmured to another, checking her notes. "That's what they're calling her." I paused at the bottom of the steps, the words sinking in. The daughter who broke the silence. It wasn't fame. It wasn't victory. It was truth. That was all I had ever wanted. My mother joined me a moment later, walking carefully down the stairs. Her posture was straighter than I'd seen it in years, her eyes bright. "He can't hurt anyone now," she said softly. "No," I said, looking out across the crowd. "He can't." The three of us. My mother, Jack, and I stood for a moment at the edge of the courthouse lawn. The cameras clicked, capturing something they didn't understand. To them, it was the end of a scandal. To us, it was the beginning of something new, a life built on truth instead of fear. When the reporters finally dispersed, I turned to Jack. "Do you think this will ever feel real?" He smiled faintly. "It already is. You just haven't caught up to it yet." We started walking toward the parking lot, the courthouse shrinking behind us. My mother walked a few steps ahead, her silhouette small against the bright afternoon sky. I watched her for a moment, realizing how much she had changed. The woman who once whispered apologies now moved with quiet certainty. Jack touched my arm lightly. "You should be proud of her." "I am," I said. "I think she finally found her voice." He smiled. "And you helped her do it." The breeze picked up, carrying the faint sounds of traffic and distant voices. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace, though it was still fragile, still forming. As we reached the car, my mother turned back to look at the courthouse one last time. "I never thought I'd see justice," she said. "Not in this lifetime." I followed her gaze. "Neither did I." She smiled faintly. "Maybe now we can start over." "Maybe," I said, though part of me knew starting over wasn't really possible. "The past doesn't disappear, it lingers quieter, maybe, but still present, still teaching." When she got into the car, I stayed behind for a moment, staring up at the courthouse steps. The sunlight glinted off the marble columns, bright and clean. I thought of the years spent hiding behind closed doors, the way silence had shaped every part of who I was, and I realized that breaking it hadn't just freed my family, it had freed me. Jack called my name softly, but I didn't move right away. I needed one more moment to breathe, to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The pain, the loss, the truth, all of it. Then I took a slow breath, turned toward the street and began to walk. The crowd was gone, the noise had faded, and for the first time in a very long time, I walked, not away from something, but toward peace. The first few weeks after the trial felt strange, quiet in a way I wasn't used to. After months of chaos, there were no more phone calls, no headlines, no lawyers or reporters waiting outside my door. Just the hum of city traffic and the soft rhythm of my own breathing. I had returned to Seattle, to the small apartment that had always been my refuge, though now it felt different. The shadows seemed lighter, the air somehow cleaner. I had survived the storm, but I wasn't yet sure what life would look like beyond it. I spent the first few days cleaning, rearranging, trying to make the space feel alive again. Dust had settled on everything, the furniture, the windowsills, the parts of my life I had put on hold. My design studio had been closed for months. My clients had long since moved on. Still, I reopened it one careful step at a time. It wasn't about rebuilding a business. It was about reclaiming something that belonged to me. The first morning back, I stood in the center of the empty studio sunlight, spilling across the wooden floors. The walls were bare, the shelves half empty, but I felt something I hadn't felt in years: possibility. I ran my hand over the old drafting table, tracing the faint pencil marks left behind. Every line, every imperfection told a story. Maybe that's what healing was, I thought. not erasing the marks, but learning to live with them. My mother moved in with me not long after. The house back home had become too full of ghosts, too full of memories she no longer wanted to tend to. We found her a small room in the apartment, bright and quiet, with a view of the park. She liked to sit by the window in the mornings, reading the paper with a cup of tea. Sometimes she would look out at the people passing by and say softly, "It feels good to be invisible again." But in a good way this time. Emily started visiting on weekends. She would bring grocery stories about her work, sometimes even laughter. The distance between us had melted, replaced by an easy warmth I never thought we'd share again. She talked more openly now, her voice no longer shadowed by guilt or fear. Once as we were cooking dinner, she turned to me and said, "You know, Mum's happier here. I think you are too." I smiled, stirring the pot on the stove. "Maybe happiness isn't a place," I said. "Maybe it's just the absence of pretending." She nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just finally being seen." That night, after they'd both gone to bed, I sat by the window of my studio looking out at the city lights. Seattle had always been a place of solitude for me, but now it felt like something else, like home. The noise of the city wasn't overwhelming anymore. It was grounding. The rhythm of life continued indifferent to everything that had happened, and somehow that felt comforting. Every now and then, the past would creep in memories of my father, flashes of the courtroom echoes of the things he'd said. But they no longer haunted me. They were just pieces of a story that had already ended. I had learned to let them pass through me like wind through an open window. Work began to return slowly. Former clients reached out, some apologizing for believing the lies they'd read. I accepted their words, but didn't dwell on them. I wasn't the same woman who had once designed homes to make other people feel safe. Now I wanted to create spaces that made people feel real, flawed, human alive. One afternoon, as I was setting up a new project, my mother came into the studio holding a letter. "This came for you," she said. It was from the court. Inside was a formal statement confirming that the estate had been fully restored to its rightful heirs. My grandfather's farmhouse, the trust, the accounts, everything my father had stolen was being divided according to the original will. There was even a handwritten note from the executor. "Your grandfather would be proud of the woman you've become." I folded the letter carefully, a quiet smile tugging at my lips. For so long I had fought to expose the truth for justice, but this small acknowledgement of his faith felt like peace. That evening my mother and I cooked together. She hummed softly as she chopped vegetables, the sound low and steady. "You know," she said, "your grandfather used to say fairness always finds its way home." I didn't believe him then. I do now. "I think he'd be happy to know that," I replied. Later, after she had gone to bed, I cleaned up the dishes and stepped out onto the balcony. The night air was cool, the city lights glittering against the dark sky. I thought of how far I had come from the girl who had once stayed quiet at her father's table to the woman who had stood in court and refused to be silenced. The peace I'd been searching for wasn't loud or triumphant. It was simple. It was this moment, the stillness after so many storms, the sound of my mother sleeping peacefully in the next room, the gentle hum of the city below. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from my past. I was walking towards something better. I turned back toward the studio, checking the last of the lights. That's when I heard it a knock at the door. It was late, close to midnight. For a moment, I thought maybe it was Emily forgetting her purse again. I wiped my hands and opened the door. Jack stood there. He looked tired, his coat damp from the rain, his hair windblown, but his eyes were the same steady, warm searching. "Jack," I said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" He gave a faint smile. "I was in town for an interview. Thought I'd stop by." He hesitated, glancing past me into the studio. "You've been busy," I nodded. "Trying to be." He shifted slightly, his hands tucked in his pockets. "You look better. Peace suits you." I smiled. "I'm still figuring out what that feels like." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Can we talk?" Something in his voice made my heart tighten. Not urgency exactly, but something gentler, something unresolved. I stepped aside, opening the door wider, Of course, I said, come in. As he stepped into the warm light of the studio, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. Whatever this conversation was going to be, whatever came next, it wouldn't undo anything. It would only add to the truth I'd already built. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what came after. We sat at my kitchen table for a while, Jack and I letting the rain fill the silence between us. It was a soft, steady kind of rain, the kind that felt like it was washing the world clean. He'd brought coffee from the shop down the street, the same one where we used to meet during the investigation back, when every conversation felt like a mission. But tonight, there was no strategy, no plan. Just two people sitting quietly, letting the weight of everything settle. You did it, he said finally, breaking the silence. You really did it. I gave a small smile, stirring my coffee. We did it. You were there every step of the way. He shook his head. No, Nicole. I've seen people fight for justice before, but not like you. You didn't just expose a man, you broke a cycle. You changed what silence meant in your family. His words landed gently, but I felt them deeply. For months, everything had been about survival, about proving, defending, uncovering. Hearing it spoken so simply made it feel real, almost tangible. It still doesn't feel like I've won anything, I said. It feels like I just stopped losing. Jack looked at me for a long time. Sometimes that's what winning really is. After a moment, he stood and looked toward the window. The rain had lightened the sky, breaking open into a faint silver mist. Come on, he said, nodding toward the door. Let's get some air. You've been hiding behind these walls for too long. We walked down to the waterfront, the same stretch of pier I'd gone to whenever I needed to think. The city light shimmered against the wet pavement, and the water moved lazily below, dark but alive. I wrapped my coat tighter, the wind biting but not unkind. For a while, we didn't speak. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was honest, the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. When Jack finally spoke, his voice was low, thoughtful. You know, when we started this, I thought I was helping you find the truth. But I think you were the one helping me. I looked at him curious. Helping you? How? He smiled faintly. I've been chasing stories my whole life. Corruption lies people like your father. But I never stopped to think about what happens to the people left standing afterward. Watching you, it reminded me that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about healing too. I turned my gaze back toward the water. Healing's harder, I said. Punishment ends with a verdict. Healing keeps going. He nodded. Yeah, it does. We stopped near the edge of the pier, the air damp and cold. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the horizon. You know, he said, after a moment I wasn't sure if I should come tonight. I didn't want to intrude on the peace you finally found. You're not intruding, I said softly. He looked at me, then really looked. His expression was gentle but unguarded, and for a moment I saw the same steadiness that had carried me through the darkest days, the same patience, the same quiet strength. Nicole, he said, his voice careful, I care about you, more than I probably should. I didn't answer right away. The words hung in the air, delicate, almost fragile. I felt my heart tighten, not from surprise, but from the ache of understanding. I had known this was coming, maybe even from the beginning. Jack, I said finally, you've been my anchor through all of this. You showed up when no one else would, and I'll never forget that. He nodded, slowly waiting, but I think I continued, my voice steady. I need to find out who I am now without the noise, without the fight, without anyone defining me by what I survived. I need to find myself first. He didn't look disappointed. If anything, his expression softened, a kind of quiet respect in his eyes. I figured you'd say that, he said. And you're right. We stood there for a long moment, side by side, the wind catching the ends of my hair, the sound of water lapping against the pier. The city glowed faintly behind us, distant but safe. Do you ever wonder, I asked, what happens to people like us after the story ends? Jack smiled. I think people like us don't get endings, just quieter beginnings. I laughed softly. That sounds like something you'd write. Maybe I will, he said, if you'll let me. I think some stories belong to both of us now, I said. He turned his hand, brushing against mine, just a fleeting touch, but enough to remind me of everything we'd been through together. For what it's worth, he said, I'll be here, wherever you end up. I know, I said quietly. We started walking back toward the city, the lights reflecting in long, broken lines across the water. It wasn't goodbye, not really, but it was an ending of sorts, the kind that doesn't hurt because it feels right. When we reached my building, he turned to me. You're cool. I will, I said. Eventually. He smiled. No rush, you've earned the quiet. And with that, he slipped his hands into his pockets and walked away, his figure fading into the drizzle and the streetlights. I watched until he disappeared, the soft echo of his footsteps blending with the rain. Back upstairs, the apartment felt still but not lonely. My mother was asleep, her door slightly ajar. I walked into the studio, the scent of paint and coffee lingering faintly in the air. I sat at my desk and stared out at the skyline. The city looked softer now, like it too had exhaled. My phone buzzed against the table. I picked it up, expecting a message from Emily, or maybe Jack, checking to make sure I'd gotten home safely. But it was an unfamiliar number with a short message. This is WSRN Radio Seattle. We've been following your story. Would you consider and interview your voice in your own words? I stared at the screen, my heartbeat quickening slightly. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then slowly I smiled. For years, I'd been afraid of speaking. Now, someone was asking me to tell my story. Maybe the world wasn't done listening. Maybe finally neither was I. The next morning, the sky was pale grey, a thin drizzle softening the city's edges. I made coffee, opened the studio windows, and let the cool air drift in. It was the kind of morning that asked for quieter time for small routines, not big revelations. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of that message from the radio station. I hadn't replied yet. Something in me hesitated, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what came next. Speaking my truth to the world felt different now. It wasn't about exposing pain anymore. It was about understanding it. I sat at my desk, sorting through invoices and reopening old client files. The studio was slowly coming back to life. The scent of fresh paint lingered from yesterday's touch-ups, and light pooled over the wooden floors like a soft blessing. My mother was still asleep. Her door cracked open just enough for me to hear her faint, rhythmic breathing. The sound was comforting, steady, alive. A rhythm I had learned to depend on again. Just as I started answering emails, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, a courier stood there holding a long white envelope and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Delivery for Nicole Barnes, he said. His tone was professional, but his eyes held curiosity, the kind people carried when they recognized your name from somewhere they couldn't quite place. Thank you, I said, signing his clipboard. The package was light, the envelope crisp and plain except for my name written in careful cursive. No return address, no indication of who had sent it. I set the parcel on the table, my heart tightening with a flicker of unease. The last anonymous delivery I'd received had nearly destroyed my family. Still, something about this one felt different, gentler, intentional. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter written in elegant handwriting that was unmistakable. Nicole, by the time you read this, I'll be gone from Seattle. Maybe farther than that. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I couldn't leave without doing one decent thing in this lifetime. You may not know it yet, but your studio is safe. The debts have been cleared. The lease renewed for the next 5 years. I made sure of it before I left. Consider it not a gift, but a restitution of sorts. Something I owed you, though no payment could ever balance the scales. You deserved peace. I didn't. Susan, I read it twice, the words softening each time. My breath caught somewhere between sorrow and relief. I set the letter down and opened the parcel. Inside was a small box containing an old silver brooch, a delicate design of intertwined lilies. I recognized it immediately. Susan had worn it at Emily's wedding the day everything began to unravel. I remembered how the light had caught it as she laughed across the room, how I'd thought then that it looked like something precious. something with a story behind it. I ran my thumb over the cool metal, noticing the faint scratches along the back. There was an inscription, barely visible now, for what was lost and for what remains. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the moment pressing down gently but firmly. Susan's life had been one long echo of loss, her child, her love, her dignity. And yet even after everything, she had found a way to give something back. Not out of guilt alone, I thought, but out of recognition. Perhaps she had finally understood what I had come to realize too late. Peace isn't something you take, it's something you offer. I thought about her walking away from Seattle, her figure fading like a shadow at dusk. No grand gestures, no final confrontation, just a letter and a gesture of quiet grace. Maybe that was the closest she could come to redemption. For a long time, I didn't move. The studio felt heavier, quieter, as if her spirit lingered in the walls. I placed the brooch on my desk beside a small vase of fresh tulips. The silver caught the morning light, refracting it into thin threads across the tabletop. I picked up the letter again and read it one last time, tracing the words, "You deserved peace." I didn't. Something in me softened. She had been both the wound and the warning. The woman who betrayed and the woman who understood too late. I didn't know if forgiveness was the right word for what I felt, but I knew I couldn't hold on to the anger anymore. It didn't belong to me now. I went to my bookshelf and pulled out the leather-bound journal I'd been keeping since the trial. Inside were fragments of everything, notes, sketches, thoughts too messy to say aloud. I tucked Susan's letter inside the back cover, pressing it flat. Not as evidence, not as closure, just as a reminder that even broken people can leave behind something whole. I sat at the desk for a while longer, watching the rain streak down the window. The city outside was slow and grey, the kind of day that made people linger indoors. I wondered where Susan had gone. Somewhere quiet, probably. Somewhere she could disappear. Maybe she'd finally found the silence she'd always chased. Not the kind that hides the truth, but the kind that lets it rest. When my mother woke, she found me still at the desk. "You're up early," she said, her voice groggy but kind. "I couldn't sleep," I said. "I got a letter." She gave me a knowing look. From her, I nodded. "She's gone, but she did something good before she left." My mother walked over and rested a hand on my shoulder. "Then let her go in peace." I smiled faintly. "I already have." The day unfolded quietly after that. Emily stopped by with lunch and the three of us ate together, laughing about nothing in particular. The warmth between us had felt effortless now, like something we'd earned. Later that afternoon, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, the letter still on my mind. The city hummed below, its rhythm steady and alive. Somewhere out there, Susan was starting over, or maybe finishing what little of her story remained. I looked down at the brooch pinned to my sweater. The silver caught the light, again glinting softly against the grey sky. I thought about the strange ways forgiveness arrives, not with ceremony, but in quiet gestures folded in envelopes wrapped in brown paper. My phone vibrated on the table, breaking my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was my mother. Her name flashed once, then again. I took a breath, answering it quickly, my voice calm but alert. "Mum, what's wrong?" There was a pause on the other end, and then her voice trembling slightly but composed. "Nicole," she said, "I think you should come home. There's something you need to see." I felt my heart tighten, the familiar edge of unease returning just as the city lights flickered on outside. "Okay," I said, standing. "I'm on my way." And as I locked the studio behind me, I couldn't help but think that even after all the noise, all the endings, life still had more to say. The drive back to my mother's house felt strangely calm. The rain had stopped, leaving the roads slick and shining under a pale afternoon sky. I hadn't been to the old house since she moved in with me months ago. When she'd called that morning, her voice carried an edge of urgency but not fear. Just a quiet importance. "Come home," she'd said. So I did. When I pulled up the familiar dirt lane, the Barnes house stood exactly as I remembered it, paint-peeling porch sagging, but still there stubborn as ever. Time hadn't softened it, only revealed its truth. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the damp scent of earth and old maple leaves. The wind carried the faint creak of the porch swing, still moving in the breeze. My mother was waiting in the living room when I walked in. She was smaller, somehow wrapped in her wool cardigan, her tea steaming gently in her hands. "You made it," she said, her eyes soft but unreadable. "Of course," I said. "You said it was important." "It is," she replied. "But before I show you, I need to say something." I sat down across from her. The light through the window framed her face in gold, and for a moment I saw not just my mother but the woman she might have been before fear took hold. "When you were little," she began, "you used to ask why I never stood up to your father. I always said silence kept the peace." Her fingers tightened around her mug. "I was wrong. Silence doesn't keep peace, it kills it." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. "Every time I stayed quiet, I gave him more power. I thought I was protecting you. But I was just teaching you how to disappear. You were right to break the silence, Nicole. You saved us both." The words settled in the air between us, simple and heavy. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to say it, that I'd already forgiven her, but I knew she needed to speak it aloud. "Come," she said softly, standing. "There's something upstairs you should see." We climbed the old staircase together, the wood groaning beneath our steps. In my childhood room, sunlight fell across the desk where I'd once written in my journals. On it sat a small leather case, worn and familiar. "I found this in the attic," my mother said. "It's your father's old camera." I approached, slowly running my hand over the cracked leather. His initials were still faintly visible. The camera felt cool and solid when I lifted it, heavy with memory. For a moment, I could almost hear the click of the shutter, see him standing there, capturing the smiles he wanted the world to believe. "He used to take pictures of us," I murmured. "Yes," my mother said, "but maybe it's time you take one for yourself." We went outside. The air was crisp, the grass damp beneath our feet. The maple tree in the yard had lost most of its leaves, but its branches stretched high against the clearing sky. I lifted the camera, pointing it toward the horizon. The frame filled with light, soft, uneven, alive. The shutter clicked, a sound so small, yet it felt like something breaking open inside me. My mother watched from the porch. "You always had an eye for the truth," she said. I smiled faintly. "I used to think taking pictures meant holding on. But maybe it's really about letting go." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it's about seeing what's still beautiful after everything else has gone." We stood there together, the air still and bright. I looked up at the sky, wide, endless, untouched by all the things that had broken us. My father's shadow no longer lingered here. Just light, just space. I thought of everything that had brought me to this moment. The anger, the fear, the noise. And now, the quiet. The kind that didn't hide truth, but carried it gently. "Forgiving isn't forgetting," I whispered. "It's choosing peace." My mother stepped closer, her hand brushing my arm. "Then, my darling, you've already done it." The words filled me with something warm and steady. I lifted the camera again, turning it toward her. She laughed softly. "Don't take my picture. I'm a mess." I clicked the shutter anyway. "You're perfect," I said. We went back inside as the sun began to set. The house glowed with that soft late light that makes everything seem golden. I looked around one last time, the faded photographs, the worn furniture, the cracks in the walls. Once this place had been a cage. Now it just felt human. Before leaving, I set the camera on the old desk again, beside one of the photographs my father had taken years ago, a family portrait. The edges were curling, the colours faded. But instead of anger, I felt something else when I looked at it, gratitude maybe for the lessons hidden in the hurt. Outside, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet leaves. I walked toward the car with my mother beside me, her hand looped through mine. The sky had deepened to a soft pink, the kind of colour that doesn't last long but stays in memory. I paused at the edge of the driveway, turning back to look at the house one last time. The windows glowed from the inside, and for the first time in my life, the sight didn't make me ache. It made me smile. The wind moved gently through the trees, whispering in a language older than grief. And in that sound, I felt something settle quietly in my chest. Not an ending, not even relief, just home. And for the first time, I felt I was home. And that was my story, a journey through silence, truth, and the slow discovery of peace. For most of my life, I believed silence was the price of love, that keeping quiet would protect my family, keep things calm, make life easier. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It only hides the truth until it hurts too much to bear. When I finally spoke, I thought it would break everything apart. Instead, it set me free. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about making peace with it so it no longer controls who you are. Maybe you've lived something like this too. Maybe you've had to choose between staying quiet and standing up for what's right. If you have, I hope my story reminds you that your voice has power. Speaking your truth isn't selfish, it's survival. And even if it shakes, even if no one wants to hear it at first, say it anyway. Because peace isn't born from silence, it's born from honesty. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What does forgiveness mean to you? Have you ever found the courage to break a silence that needed to end? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. Your stories matter, and they might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story meant something to you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Every comment, every subscription helps these stories reach more people. People who might be waiting for a reminder that healing is still possible. This community isn't just about stories. It's about connection, hope, and the small acts of courage that change us. If you know someone who needs this message, share it with them. Sometimes hearing one honest voice can be the start of someone else's freedom. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, real peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from truth.